Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Brian Wright, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Pisgah National Forest, North Carolina, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip with my best friend Marcus. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know what really happened out there, in case I don't make it through the night, in case it comes back for me. Marcus, Chen, and I had been planning this trip for months. Both of us worked soul-crushing office jobs in Charlotte, and we desperately needed to escape the fluorescent prison of cubicles and conference calls. Marcus was the outdoorsy type, always talking about survival techniques he'd learned from YouTube videos, constantly prepping for some imaginary apocalypse. Me? I just wanted to get away from the city noise and breathe clean air for a few days. We chose the Linville Gorge wilderness area specifically because Marcus had read about its isolation. Barely any cell service, practically no other hikers this time of year, he'd said with that excited grin of his. Just us and nature, man. Pure wilderness experience. The plan was simple. Park at the Wiseman's View overlook, hike down into the gorge, set up camp near the Linville River, and spend 3 days fishing, hiking, and pretending we were rugged outdoorsmen instead of software engineers who ordered takeout 5 nights a week. Looking back, I should have paid attention to the warnings. The first red flag came from the park ranger at the information center. When Marcus mentioned our planned route, the ranger, a weathered man in his 60s with deep-set eyes, went completely still. "You boys sure about that particular area?" he asked, his voice carrying an odd weight. "Had some incidents down there recently. Might want to consider the Table Rock Trail instead. More traveled, safer." Marcus laughed it off. "What kind of incidents? Bear attacks?" The ranger's face darkened. "Not bears, son. Something else. Folks going missing. Equipment found scattered like—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Just be careful. Stick together. Don't go wandering off alone, especially after dark." Marcus and I exchanged glances. I felt a chill run down my spine, but Marcus was practically vibrating with excitement. "See? This is perfect. Brian. Real adventure. Real wilderness experience." That should have been warning enough, but I was too caught up in Marcus's enthusiasm to think clearly. Besides, what were the odds of running into trouble? The ranger was probably just trying to scare tourists away from the more remote areas. We set off late Thursday morning, loaded down with enough gear to survive a week. Marcus had insisted on bringing his expensive camping equipment, ultralight tent, high-tech sleeping bags, portable water filtration system, the works. I'd contributed the food supplies and my father's old camping gear, including his vintage Coleman lantern that had seen better days but still worked reliably. The hike down into the gorge was breathtaking. The autumn foliage painted the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds, and the crisp October air filled our lungs with each step. The trail wound through dense forest, past massive granite outcroppings and over crystal-clear streams. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. We made good time, reaching the river by late afternoon. Marcus found what he declared to be the perfect campsite, a small clearing beside the water surrounded by towering hemlocks and protected from wind by a wall of moss-covered boulders. We set up camp efficiently, Marcus taking charge of the tent while I gathered firewood and set up our cooking area. "This is it, man," Marcus said as we sat by our newly lit campfire watching the sun sink behind the ridge. "This is what life should be like. No emails, no meetings, no bullshit. Just us and the wilderness." I had to admit he was right. The silence was incredible. No traffic, no city noise, just the gentle sound of water flowing over rocks and the occasional bird call from the darkening forest. It was exactly what we'd both needed. That first night, we cooked dinner over the fire, told stories, and planned our hiking routes for the next 2 days. Marcus was in his element, demonstrating various survival techniques he'd learned online, showing me how to identify edible plants and read animal tracks. I found myself relaxing for the first time in months. But as full darkness settled over the gorge, something changed. The forest sounds stopped. It wasn't gradual. One moment we could hear the normal nighttime symphony of insects and small animals, and the next, complete silence. Even the river seemed quieter, as if the water itself was holding its breath. "That's weird," I muttered, looking around our firelit circle. Beyond the orange glow, the darkness was absolute, pressing against us like a living thing. Marcus was checking his phone. No signal at all. GPS is acting strange too. Keeps showing our location jumping around. He frowned at the screen. "That's not right. These coordinates put us about 5 miles from where we actually are." A stick cracked somewhere in the forest behind us. We both froze. "Probably just a deer," Marcus whispered, but his voice carried uncertainty. He reached for his high-powered flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line. Nothing but trees and shadows that seemed to shift and dance in the artificial light. Another crack, closer this time. Then a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural groan that didn't belong to any animal I knew. It came from the darkness beyond our fire, somewhere up the slope to our left. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Marcus was already on his feet, flashlight beam dancing nervously across the forest. "I don't know. Could be a bear, maybe. They make weird sounds sometimes." But it hadn't sounded like a bear. It had sounded almost human. Almost like someone in terrible pain or terrible hunger. The sound came again, from a different direction this time. Behind us, near the river. Then again, from our right. It was as if whatever was making that noise was circling us, staying just outside the ring of firelight. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think we should pack up. Leave. Now." He looked at me like I'd suggested we sprout wings and fly home. "Are you kidding? We just got here. It's probably nothing. Wild animals testing our boundaries. This is normal wilderness behavior, Brian. We just need to show we're not afraid." To prove his point, he cupped his hands around his mouth and called out into the darkness. "Hey, whatever you are, you're not welcome here. This is our camp." The immediate silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. Even the river seemed to stop flowing. Then, from multiple directions at once, came an answering call. A howl that started low and human-sounding but twisted into something impossibly high and inhuman. It lasted far too long, and when it finally ended, my ears were ringing. "Okay," Marcus said, his bravado cracking. That was definitely not normal." We spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, taking turns keeping watch while the other tried unsuccessfully to sleep. The sounds continued sporadically. Footsteps circling our camp, branches breaking, and occasionally that horrible howling from different directions. Sometimes I thought I could see shapes moving between the trees, tall and impossibly thin, but whenever I pointed the flashlight toward them, there was nothing there. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally rose, painting the gorge in soft golden light, the forest came alive again with normal sounds. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, and the river resumed its cheerful babbling. It was as if the previous night had been a nightmare shared between two exhausted minds. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested over breakfast, spooning instant oatmeal with hands that still shook slightly. "Cut the trip short. We can try again another time, different location." Marcus shook his head stubbornly. "No way. I'm not letting some weird animal sound scare us off. This is exactly the kind of challenge we came here for. Real wilderness. Real adventure. Besides, look around. It's beautiful. Peaceful. Whatever was out there last night is gone now." He was right about the beauty. In daylight, our campsite looked like something from a nature magazine. The morning mist rose from the river in ghostly wisps, and the surrounding forest stretched endlessly in all directions. a cathedral of ancient trees and moss-covered stones. It was hard to reconcile this serene landscape with the terror we'd felt just hours before. Against my better judgment, I agreed to stay another night. We spent Friday exploring the area around our camp, following game trails and scrambling over boulder fields. Marcus was in his element, pointing out animal tracks and identifying plants, his enthusiasm infectious despite my lingering unease. By afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself that the previous night had been nothing more than our imaginations running wild in an unfamiliar environment. That's when we found the first sign that something was seriously wrong. We were following what Marcus had identified as a deer trail when we came across a backpack hanging from a tree branch about 8 feet off the ground. It was expensive looking, barely weathered, and definitely hadn't been there long. "How does a backpack end up hanging in a tree?" I asked, staring up at it. Marcus was already climbing, his natural athleticism making the ascent look easy. "Maybe someone was trying to keep it away from bears," he called down, but his voice carried doubt. When he brought the pack down and we examined its contents, my unease deepened into genuine fear. Inside were supplies for at least a week-long trip: food, water purification tablets, camping gear, and a detailed topographical map of the area. But everything was in perfect condition, as if the owner had simply vanished mid-hike. The most disturbing part was the camera we found in a side pocket. Marcus managed to get it working, and we scrolled through the photos with growing horror. The early images showed a group of 4 college-aged hikers, 2 men, 2 women, setting up camp in various locations throughout the gorge. Happy faces, scenic vistas, normal vacation photos. But the later images told a different story. The photos became increasingly erratic: blurry shots of the forest at night, panicked selfies with terrified expressions, and finally, a series of images that made my stomach turn. They showed the campsite in chaos. Tent torn apart, gear scattered, and in the background of several photos, tall, shadowy figures that seemed wrong somehow, as if their proportions didn't quite match human anatomy. The last photo was a close-up of a young woman's face, tears streaming down her cheeks, mouth open in what was clearly a scream. Behind her, barely visible in the darkness, something else was captured: a pale, gaunt face with sunken eyes and a mouth full of what looked like too many teeth. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered. "We need to report this. These people are missing. They might still be alive." But even as he said it, we both knew better. The photos were dated 3 weeks ago. Whatever had happened to those hikers, they were long past helping. I wanted to leave immediately, but Marcus insisted we search the area for more clues first. If these people are dead, their families deserve to know what happened. And if they're somehow still alive... So we spent the rest of the afternoon combing the forest around where we'd found the backpack. What we discovered made the situation infinitely worse. Half a mile downstream, we found their campsite, or what remained of it. The scene looked like a tornado had torn through the area. Tent fabric hung in shreds from tree branches, sleeping bags were ripped open with their stuffing scattered across the forest floor, and cooking equipment lay twisted and broken among the rocks. But it wasn't the destruction that made my hands shake as I took photos with my own camera. It was the complete absence of bodies. There was plenty of blood. Dark stains on the rocks, splattered across tree trunks, soaked into the earth in irregular patterns. But no bodies. No bones. Nothing to indicate what had happened to 4 human beings. Marcus found the footprints. "Brian," he called from the edge of the destroyed campsite, his voice tight with fear. "You need to see this." The tracks were unlike anything in his wilderness guides. They looked almost human at first glance, the right size and general shape, but wrong in crucial ways. The toes were too long, ending in what appeared to be claws rather than toenails. The heel was too narrow, and the arch was so pronounced it was almost triangular. Most disturbing of all, the stride length suggested something much taller than any human should be. "What kind of animal makes tracks like that?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer wasn't going to be found in any field guide. Marcus was examining the prints with his magnifying glass, his face pale. "I don't know. They're not in any of my books. They're almost human, but wrong. Like someone tried to copy human feet from memory and got the details wrong." We followed the tracks for about 100 yards before they suddenly stopped at the edge of a granite slab. Not faded away or become hard to see, just stopped, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. By the time we made it back to our own camp, the sun was setting again, and the familiar dread was settling over the gorge like a suffocating blanket. We'd decided to pack up and leave first thing in the morning, but we had to survive one more night. This time, we were prepared. We'd moved our camp closer to the river, where the sound of flowing water might mask our movements. Marcus had rigged an early warning system using fishing line and empty cans around the perimeter of our site. We'd built up the fire larger than necessary and arranged our sleeping bags so we could both keep watch simultaneously. None of it mattered. The attack started just after full dark. It began with the sounds again. That inhuman howling echoing from multiple directions, closer than the night before. Then came the footsteps, circling our camp in a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random animal behavior. "There," Marcus whispered, pointing his flashlight beam toward a gap between two large boulders. I saw something moving. I followed his light with my own, and for just a moment I caught a glimpse of something that made my rational mind simply shut down. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin to the point of appearing skeletal. Its skin was pale as moonlight and stretched taut over angular bones. But it was the face that haunts me still, even as I write this. Sunken eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's, but with an intelligence behind them that was cold and calculating. Its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged teeth that looked designed for tearing rather than chewing. When our lights hit it, the thing didn't flee like a startled animal would. Instead, it smiled, and that smile revealed even more teeth than should have been possible. Then it stepped backward into the shadows and vanished. "Did you see that?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. Before I could answer, our fishing line perimeter alarm went off. 3 cans rattled simultaneously from different directions, meaning we were surrounded. "The tent," I whispered. "We need to get in the tent." It was a stupid plan. Thin nylon would provide no protection against whatever was out there, but it was the only shelter we had. We grabbed our flashlights and scrambled inside, zipping the entrance shut behind us as if that would somehow keep out the nightmare outside. For several minutes, we lay there in the dark, listening to footsteps circling our tent. Sometimes they sounded human, the steady rhythm of bipedal movement. Other times, they seemed to shift into something else, a loping gait that covered ground impossibly fast. Then Marcus's flashlight began to flicker. "No, no, no," he muttered, shaking the device. "Fresh batteries this morning. It should be fine." My own light was dimming too, the bright LED beam fading to an orange glow that barely illuminated the inside of our tent. Even my father's old Coleman lantern, which had never failed me before, began to sputter and fade. That's when we heard the voice. "Help me!" It called from outside our tent, and my heart nearly stopped because I recognized it. It sounded exactly like the young woman from the photos we'd found, the one whose terrified face had been the last image on that camera. "Please, help me," the voice continued, closer now, right outside our tent. "They took my friends. I've been hiding for days. Please, I'm hurt." Marcus reached for the tent zipper. I grabbed his wrist. "Don't," I hissed. "That's not human. The hikers from the photos. They disappeared 3 weeks ago. That's not her." But the voice was so convincing, so desperate and afraid. "Please, I can see your light. I know you're in there. They're coming back. We have to go now." Marcus looked at me, torn between his natural desire to help and the growing certainty that something was very wrong. The woman's voice was perfect. The right tone, the right accent, even the right breathing patterns of someone in distress. But underneath it, barely audible, was something else. A wet, clicking sound like insects moving. "If you're really human," Marcus called out, "tell us something that only a person would know. What's the capital of North Carolina?" Silence. Then the voice changed. It deepened, becoming something that might have once been male but was now something else entirely. "Come out, Marcus. Come out, Brian. We know you're in there. We've been watching you since you arrived. We know your names. We know your fears." My blood turned to ice. How could it know our names? We hadn't introduced ourselves to anyone except the park ranger, and he was miles away. "You taste of city pollution and soft living," the voice continued, and now it was coming from multiple directions at once, as if several creatures were speaking in unison. "But underneath, there's meat. Good meat. Tender meat. We've been so hungry." Marcus was hyperventilating beside me. "This isn't happening," he whispered. "This is stress hallucinations. Too much coffee, not enough sleep. This isn't real." But it was real, and it was about to get worse. Something began scratching at the tent fabric above our heads. Long, deliberate scratches that parted the nylon like tissue paper. Through the growing holes, I could see pale fingers, too long, with joints in the wrong places, probing downward toward us. "Run," I said. We burst out of the tent simultaneously, Marcus going left toward the river while I went right toward the trees. In my peripheral vision, I saw him stumble and fall, then scramble to his feet and keep running. I heard splashing as he hit the water, then nothing. I made it about 50 yards into the forest before something tackled me from behind. The impact drove me face first into the ground, tasting dirt and blood. Claws raked across my back, shredding my jacket and the skin beneath. I rolled over and found myself staring up at one of the creatures, the same impossibly tall, skeletal thing we'd glimpsed earlier. Up close, it was even more horrifying. Its skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent, showing dark veins and organs beneath. Its fingers ended in black claws at least 4 inches long, and its mouth— God, its mouth was full of needle-sharp teeth arranged in multiple rows like a shark's. But the worst part was its eyes. They held intelligence. Malevolent, alien intelligence that studied me like a specimen. "Marcus called you Brian," it said in a voice like grinding bone. "Brian Wright, age 29, software engineer from Charlotte. Your blood type is O negative. Very rare, very precious. Your greatest fear is being trapped in small spaces. Claustrophobia, isn't it? We can smell the fear on you. It makes the meat sweeter." It leaned closer and I could smell its breath, a mixture of rotting meat and something chemical, like battery acid. "Your friend ran toward the water. Foolish. We swim better than we run. He's probably dead already, torn apart by our cousins who hunt the riverbank. But you will keep alive a little longer. Fear improves the flavor." I tried to speak, to scream, to do anything, but terror had paralyzed my vocal cords. The creature placed one clawed hand on my chest, pressing down until I could barely breathe. "Do you know what we are, Brian Wright?" it asked conversationally. "Your species has many names for us. Wendigo, Windigo, Wetico, the cannibalistic spirit of eternal hunger. But we prefer our true name. Ga'agi, the ravens who feast on human suffering." It was then that I noticed the sound, a wet, tearing noise coming from somewhere near the river, accompanied by splashing and what might have been muffled screaming. "Ah," the creature said, tilting its head like a bird. "Your friend is still alive. How wonderful. The hunt continues." The distraction was all I needed. I'd managed to work my hand into my pocket during its monologue, and my fingers closed around my father's old survival knife, the one tool Marcus had mocked as outdated and unnecessary. I drove the blade up under the creature's ribcage with every ounce of strength I had. The reaction was immediate and terrible. The thing shrieked. Not the howl we'd heard before, but a sound like breaking glass mixed with a baby's cry. It reared back, claws raking across my face, but the grip on my chest loosened enough for me to roll away. I didn't wait to see how badly I'd hurt it. I ran. Behind me, the forest erupted in inhuman screaming. Multiple voices, all shrieking in what might have been pain or rage or hunger. Branches crashed as something large gave chase, and I could hear those awful clawed feet tearing through the undergrowth. I had no plan except to reach the trail, get to higher ground, maybe find a place to hide until dawn. But the darkness seemed absolute. My flashlight was gone, dropped when the creature tackled me, and the cloud cover had hidden even the moonlight. I was running blind through dense forest, guided only by instinct and terror. That's when I heard Marcus calling my name. "Brian, over here! I found a way out!" His voice came from ahead and to my left, near where I thought the main trail should be. Relief flooded through me. He was alive. He'd escaped the creatures at the river, and he'd found our exit route. I turned toward his voice, stumbling through a stand of young pines toward what I hoped was salvation. "Keep calling," I shouted back. "I can't see anything." "Over here," Marcus's voice replied, but something was wrong with it. The tone was right, the voice was definitely his, but there was an odd echo, as if he were speaking from inside a cave. I pushed through the last of the trees and found myself in a small clearing. Marcus was standing in the center, his back to me, perfectly motionless. "Marcus," I called softly, "are you okay?" He turned around and I screamed. It was Marcus's face, but wrong. His features were too sharp, his skin too pale, and his eyes reflected the dim starlight like an animal's. When he smiled, I could see those horrible needle teeth where his normal human teeth should have been. "Hello, Brian," it said in Marcus's voice. "I told you we were excellent hunters. Your friend's memories were enlightening. We know everything about you now. Every fear, every weakness, every person you've ever cared about." "Where is he?" I managed to whisper. "Where's the real Marcus?" The thing wearing my best friend's face tilted its head. "He's here. Part of him, anyway. The part that remembered how to be human. The rest—" It gestured vaguely toward the forest. "The rest is feeding our children now." I ran again, crashing through the underbrush with no destination except away. Behind me, Marcus's stolen voice called out in perfect imitation of his cheerful, encouraging tone. "Come on, Brian. Don't leave me behind, buddy. We're supposed to stick together, remember?" But underneath the familiar words, I could hear that wet, clicking sound and something that might have been Marcus screaming. I don't remember much of the next few hours. Terror and exhaustion blurred everything into a nightmare of running, hiding, and trying not to listen to the voices of my dead friend calling to me from the darkness. Sometimes it sounded like Marcus, sometimes like the missing hikers, and once, horribly, like my own mother. Somehow, by pure luck or divine intervention, I found the trail just as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my car at the Wiseman's View parking area, fumbling with shaking hands to get the keys in the ignition. The drive back to Charlotte passed in a blur. I remember stopping at a gas station to clean the claw marks on my face and back, telling the concerned clerk I'd fallen into a thorny bush while hiking. I remember calling the Park Service to report Marcus missing, spinning a story about him wandering off during the night and never returning. I remember the search and rescue teams finding no trace of him, just like the 4 college students before him. But I also remember the ranger's expression when I described our campsite location, that same dark knowledge I'd seen when he'd tried to warn us away from the area. "You were lucky to get out," he'd said quietly, when the other officials were out of earshot. "Most folks who encounter them, well, most folks don't make it back to tell about it." "Encounter what?" I'd asked, though part of me already knew. "Old things," he'd said. "Hungry things. Things that used to be human, maybe, long time ago, before the hunger changed them into something else. The Cherokee knew about them, had warnings passed down for generations. But we stopped listening to those old stories, figured they were just superstition." He'd leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They're territorial, these things. Usually stick to the deep wilderness, away from populated areas. But every few years, when the hunger gets too strong, They venture out, take a few hikers, campers, folks who won't be missed right away. Then they disappear back into the deep woods with their provisions. Provisions? Fresh meat, son, and fresh memories. They don't just eat the body, they consume everything. Memories, personality, knowledge, makes them better hunters, better mimics. That's how they knew your names, how they could sound like your friend. They'd already taken him. I'd wanted to ask more questions, but other officials had returned, and the ranger had clammed up, returning to his official role of suggesting grief counseling and leaving contact information for the search teams. That was 3 weeks ago. The physical wounds have healed, leaving only thin scars across my back and face. The nightmares haven't stopped. I wake up every night to the sound of Marcus calling my name, and sometimes I'm not entirely sure it's just a dream. I've done research since then, diving deep into Cherokee folklore and historical accounts of mysterious disappearances in the Appalachian wilderness. The stories are there, if you know how to look. Accounts of cannibalistic spirits dating back centuries, warnings about areas where the hungry dead hunt the living. But the most disturbing thing I've learned is that the creatures don't just stay in the deep wilderness. According to several accounts, they sometimes follow their prey home, especially prey that escaped, that wounded them, that got away when they shouldn't have. 3 nights ago, I started hearing scratching at my apartment windows. Last night, I found footprints in the mud outside my building, long, clawed prints with joints in the wrong places. And tonight, as I finish writing this account, I can hear Marcus's voice calling to me from the alley behind my apartment building. "Brian," he's saying in that perfectly cheerful tone I remember so well. "Come on out, buddy. I found something amazing down here. You have to see this." But underneath his familiar voice, I can hear that wet clicking sound, and something that might be the sound of many teeth grinding together in anticipation. The scratching at my windows is getting louder. I think they found me. If anyone reads this, learn from my mistakes. Don't go into the deep wilderness alone. Don't ignore the warnings of local people who know the land. And if something calls to you from the darkness using a familiar voice, don't answer. Most importantly, if you ever encounter something that claims to be human but isn't quite right, if the proportions are wrong, if the eyes reflect light, if there are too many teeth in its smile, run. Run fast and don't look back, because these things are patient hunters, and they never forget a scent. The scratching has stopped. I think they're coming inside now. Tell my family I'm sorry. Tell them I tried to make it home. Tell them the hunger in the darkness is real, and it's still out there, waiting for the next group of hikers who think they're safe in the wilderness. Tell them to stay away from Linville Gorge. Tell them. The handwritten account ends here, the final words trailing off into illegible scratches. The notebook was found by Charlotte police during a wellness check at Mr. Wright's apartment, along with several photos showing a destroyed campsite and unidentified footprints. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Pisgah National Forest, North Carolina, deep in the mountains near Looking Glass Rock, where the old Cherokee hunting trails still wind through ancient hollows that most modern hikers never see. David Jones had been my best friend since college, and when he suggested we take a week-long backpacking trip through the most isolated section of Pisgah, I jumped at the chance. We'd both been drowning in our corporate jobs in Charlotte, and the idea of disappearing into the wilderness for a week felt like salvation. David was the outdoorsman between us, an Eagle Scout who could navigate by the stars and build shelter from pine boughs. I was more of a weekend warrior, comfortable enough on established trails but reliant on his expertise for anything more ambitious. The plan was to hike deep into the Shining Rock Wilderness area, far from the tourist-heavy sections near Sliding Rock and the Blue Ridge Parkway. David had studied topographical maps for months, plotting a route that would take us through areas where the Forest Service estimated fewer than 50 people ventured each year. He'd found mentions in old Cherokee oral histories of places with names that roughly translated to where the hungry spirits walk, and the hollow that swallows sound. I thought it was just colorful folklore. I should have paid closer attention. We started our hike on a crisp Monday morning in October, the leaves just beginning their transformation into a riot of orange and gold. The trailhead was marked only by a weathered wooden post driven into the ground beside a gravel logging road that didn't appear on any GPS system. David had found the access point through a combination of old forestry documents and forums where serious backcountry enthusiasts shared closely guarded secrets. The first day was perfect. We hiked through dense rhododendron thickets and across clear mountain streams that sang over smooth granite. The forest felt alive but welcoming, filled with the calls of birds and the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. We made good time, covering nearly 12 miles before setting up camp in a small clearing beside a stream that David's maps labeled as Hunger Creek. "Cheerful name," I remarked as we filtered water for dinner. David shrugged, focused on adjusting his water filter. "Most of these old names have stories behind them, usually about someone who died here, hunters who didn't come back, settlers who went missing. This whole region was considered sacred by the Cherokee, but also dangerous. They had rituals they'd perform before entering certain areas." "What kind of rituals?" "Protection, mostly. Ways to keep the hungry spirits from following them home." He looked up at me with a grin. "Don't worry, Mike, I brought bear spray." We cooked a simple meal of freeze-dried pasta and settled into our sleeping bags as darkness fell like a heavy curtain. The forest around us grew quiet, not the peaceful quiet of evening, but something more profound. It felt as though the wilderness was holding its breath. I was awakened sometime after midnight by the sound of David's voice. He was sitting up in his sleeping bag, staring into the darkness beyond our dying campfire. "Mike," he whispered, "do you hear that?" I strained my ears but heard nothing except my own heartbeat. "Hear what?" "Someone calling my name." The fire had burned down to glowing coals that cast strange shadows between the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the forest around our camp. Nothing moved. No eyes reflected the light back at us. "I don't hear anything, man. You were probably dreaming." David nodded slowly, but he didn't lie back down. "Yeah, probably." But his voice carried doubt, and he kept glancing toward the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. The second day started normally enough. We broke camp early and continued deeper into the wilderness, following a faint game trail that wound through a landscape growing increasingly foreign. The trees grew larger and more ancient, their trunks twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate. Massive hemlocks blocked out most of the sky, creating a twilight atmosphere even at midday. It was around noon when we first noticed the silence. "Where are all the birds?" I asked, suddenly aware that we hadn't heard any animal sounds for hours. David stopped and tilted his head, listening. "I don't know. Even the insects have gone quiet." We stood in that profound silence for several minutes, feeling increasingly unsettled. The forest around us felt empty but watchful, as if invisible eyes were tracking our every movement. "Let's keep moving," David said finally. "Maybe there's a predator in the area. That would explain why everything's gone quiet." But as we hiked deeper into the wilderness, the silence only grew more oppressive. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, and even our whispered conversations felt like violations of something sacred and terrible. By late afternoon, we reached a clearing that didn't appear on David's maps. It was perfectly circular, perhaps 50 yards across and completely bare of vegetation. The ground was hard-packed earth the color of old blood, and nothing grew there. No grass, no weeds, not even moss. In the center of the clearing stood a single dead tree, its bark stripped away and its branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. "This isn't right," David muttered, consulting his topographical map. "This clearing shouldn't exist. According to this, we should be in the middle of old-growth forest." I walked to the edge of the clearing and knelt to examine the transition between the living forest and the barren ground. There was no gradual change. One step, and you were among healthy trees and undergrowth. The next step, and you were on lifeless earth. It was as if someone had drawn a perfect circle and decreed that nothing would grow within it. "We should camp somewhere else," I said, backing away from the edge of the clearing. Something about the place made my skin crawl. David nodded agreement, but as we shouldered our packs, he paused and pointed to the base of the dead tree. "Mike, look at that." Half hidden in the shadows at the tree's base was a pile of objects. As we moved closer, I could make out the shapes: backpacks, hiking boots, water bottles, camping gear. All of it looked weathered and old, some pieces clearly having been there for years. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. "How many people have been through here?" David knelt beside the pile and carefully lifted a faded blue backpack. The fabric was sun-bleached and torn, but I could still make out a name tag. Sarah Collins, Appalachian Trail 2019. "This is from 6 years ago," David said quietly. "And look." He pointed to other items in the pile. "That sleeping bag has to be from the 80s, judging by the style, and that water bottle is so old it's practically an antique." A horrible thought occurred to me. "David, where are the people who owned this stuff?" He was already thinking the same thing. We both turned slowly to examine the clearing more carefully, looking for signs of what might have happened to the hikers who had lost their gear here. But the hard-packed earth showed no signs of disturbance. No bones or remains, nothing to indicate what fate had befallen the equipment's former owners. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice tight with growing panic. David nodded, but as we turned to leave the clearing, we discovered that the forest around us had changed. Where before there had been a clear path leading into the circle of dead earth, now there were dozens of openings between the trees. Each gap looked identical, winding away into the shadowy depths of the forest. "Which way did we come from?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. David spun in a slow circle, consulting his compass. "That's impossible. The needle is spinning. It won't settle on a direction." I pulled out my phone, hoping for GPS, but the screen showed no signal and the battery indicator was flashing red despite having been fully charged that morning. David's phone was completely dead. "The trees," David said suddenly. "They've moved." I followed his gaze and felt ice water flood my veins. The massive hemlocks that surrounded the clearing were definitely closer than they had been when we first arrived. Not by much, maybe a few feet, but enough to notice. And as I watched, frozen with terror, I could swear I saw the nearest tree shift another few inches toward us. "The trees don't move, David. Trees don't move." But even as I said it, I knew I was wrong. Something was happening here that defied rational explanation, something that made my primitive brain scream warnings about danger and death. A sound echoed across the clearing, a low, mournful call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was almost human, but wrong in a way that made my teeth ache. The sound rose and fell like a song, but the melody was composed of hunger and loneliness, and something that might have been rage. "Wendigo," David whispered, his face pale. "Oh God, Mike, I think we're in the territory of a Wendigo." I'd heard the stories. Of course, Native American legends about cannibalistic spirits that roamed the deep wilderness, eternally hungry, driven mad by their own appetite. But I'd always filed them away with other folklore, interesting stories, nothing more. The call came again, closer this time, and I could hear something moving through the forest around us. Not walking, exactly, but something between a crawl and a gallop, moving with inhuman speed through the underbrush. "What do we do?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. David was digging through his pack with frantic efficiency. "Fire," he said. "They're supposed to fear fire, and iron, cold iron, is supposed to hurt them." He pulled out his camp stove and a small fuel canister while I gathered dry wood from the edge of the clearing. As I worked, I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness between the trees. Several times I glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look directly, nothing was there. We built our fire in the center of the clearing, next to the dead tree and the pile of abandoned gear. As the flames grew higher, the sounds from the forest grew louder and more agitated. I could hear branches breaking and what sounded like claws scraping against bark. "It's testing us," David said, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire, "seeing how we react to its presence." The temperature around us began to drop. Our breath became visible in the air, and frost started forming on the ground despite the October warmth we'd experienced during the day. The flames of our fire flickered and danced as if blown by a wind I couldn't feel. That's when we heard the voice. "David," it called from the darkness beyond the tree line. "David, help me." The voice was human, female, and filled with pain and terror. But there was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl even as every instinct screamed at me to run toward the sound and help. "It's not real," David said, but his hands were shaking as he fed more wood to the fire. Wendigos can mimic human voices. They use it to lure people away from safety. "David, please," the voice called again, closer now. "It has me. It's hurting me. Please help me." This time, I recognized the voice. It was Sarah Collins, or rather, something wearing her voice like a mask. The owner of the blue backpack we'd found in the pile of abandoned gear. "How long has she been here?" I asked, my throat tight with horror. "How long has it been using her voice?" David didn't answer. He was staring into the flames, his face drawn with concentration. "Mike," he said finally, "I need you to stay very, very still. Don't move. Don't look up. Whatever you do, don't look at the tree above us." But of course, as soon as he said it, I had to look. And what I saw hanging from the branches of the dead tree above our heads made me bite through my tongue to keep from screaming. Bodies. Dozens of them, suspended from the branches like grotesque fruit. Some were recent enough that I could still recognize them as human. Others had been there so long they were little more than bone and sinew wrapped in tattered clothing. But all of them were moving slightly in the breeze, creating a soft rustling sound like wind chimes made of death. And at the top of the tree, positioned where a star might go on a Christmas tree, was something that had once been a person, but was now something else entirely. It was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs stretched to inhuman proportions. Its skin was gray-white, like old bone, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with too many teeth. But the worst part was its eyes. Human eyes, intelligent and aware, trapped in that monstrous form. As I watched in frozen terror, the thing's head turned with a sound like breaking branches, and those human eyes fixed on mine. When it smiled, I could see that its teeth were stained dark with old blood. "Found you," it said in Sarah Collins' voice. The Wendigo dropped from the tree with inhuman grace, landing in a crouch beside our fire. Up close, I could see that its elongated limbs ended in claws like broken glass, and its chest was split open to reveal a gaping cavity where its heart should have been. That hollow space was filled with shadows that moved independently, reaching toward us with tendrils of living darkness. David lunged to his feet and grabbed a burning branch from our fire. "Stay back," he shouted, waving the flames at the creature. The Wendigo recoiled with a shriek that sounded like wind through a graveyard, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it began to circle our fire, moving with jerky, unnatural movements like a broken marionette. "It's toying with us," I realized. "It could have killed us already." "Wendigos don't just kill," David said, never taking his eyes off the circling creature. "They corrupt. They turn people into creatures like themselves. It wants us to despair, to give up hope, to embrace the hunger." As if responding to his words, the Wendigo spoke again, but this time it used David's own voice. "Mike," it said with David's mouth, "Mike, I'm so hungry. I haven't eaten in days. I need you to help me." I looked at the real David, standing beside me with a burning branch in his hands, and then at the Wendigo that was speaking with his voice. The resemblance was becoming stronger by the moment. The creature's face was shifting, taking on David's features like clay being molded by invisible hands. "Don't listen to it," the real David said. "It's trying to confuse you, make you doubt what's real." But as the hours passed, and somehow it was hours, though the fire never seemed to burn lower despite our failure to add fuel, the Wendigo's deception became more sophisticated. It began to tell stories in David's voice, recounting shared memories from our friendship with perfect accuracy. It knew about the time we'd gotten lost on Mount Mitchell and had to spend the night in an emergency shelter. It knew about David's secret fear of spiders and his recurring nightmare about drowning. "How does it know these things?" I asked. But David didn't answer. He was staring at the Wendigo with a strange expression, as if he was seeing something I couldn't. The creature had stopped circling and was now standing perfectly still, its borrowed face wearing David's familiar smile. "Mike," it said in David's voice, "I need to tell you something. I need to tell you what really happened here." "Don't listen," the real David whispered, but his voice was growing fainter. "I brought you here on purpose," the Wendigo David continued. "I've been feeding this thing for years, bringing it fresh meat. You're not the first friend I've lured into these woods." I turned to look at the real David, expecting to see denial and outrage on his face. Instead, I saw guilt and something that might have been relief. "David," I said quietly. He couldn't meet my eyes. "It started 5 years ago," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I got lost on a solo trip, ended up in this clearing. It was going to kill me, but then it offered me a deal. Feed it occasionally, and it would let me live. It would share its territory with me." The fire between us flickered, and for a moment the Wendigo and David looked identical. Same face, same posture, same guilty expression. "You son of a bitch," I breathed. "How many people have you brought here?" "7, David said, his voice breaking. "You would have been the 8th. "Would have been." David looked up at me then, and I saw that his eyes had changed. They were still human, but there was something else behind them now, a hunger that made my blood run cold. "I said I was going to feed you to it," David continued, "but I think I want to keep you for myself." The transformation was subtle at first. David's fingernails grew longer and sharper. His teeth became more prominent. His skin took on a grayish pallor, but the worst change was in his posture. He began to move with the same jerky, unnatural gait as the Wendigo. I realized with growing horror that there had never been two creatures. The Wendigo had been David all along, and the David standing beside me was just another face it wore, another voice it had learned to mimic perfectly. "The real David died here 5 years ago," the creature said, its voice shifting between David's familiar tones and something far more alien. "I've been wearing his memories, his personality, his relationships. I've been living his life, working his job, maintaining his friendships, and the hunger has been growing stronger." I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at the creature, but it moved with inhuman speed, dodging aside and lashing out with claws that opened long gashes across my chest. The pain was immediate and intense, but it also brought clarity. I was alone in the wilderness with a creature that had been pretending to be my best friend for years, and my only chance of survival was to reach the edge of this cursed clearing. I ran toward what I hoped was the path we'd use to enter the clearing, but the trees had closed ranks, creating an impenetrable wall of branches and thorns. Behind me, I could hear the Wendigo laughing with David's voice, but the sound was wrong. Too high, too long, filled with an inhuman amusement. "There's no way out, Mike," it called. "This clearing exists outside normal space. Time moves differently here. You've been here for 3 days, not 3 hours. Your water ran out yesterday. You're already starting to feel the hunger, aren't you?" It was right. My mouth was parched, my stomach cramping with desperate need. When had I last eaten? I couldn't remember. The hunger was like a living thing inside me, clawing at my insides, demanding to be fed. "I can end the hunger," the Wendigo said, approaching slowly. "I can make it stop. All you have to do is take a bite. Just one small bite of human flesh, and the hunger will transform into something beautiful, something powerful. I pressed my back against the wall of trees, feeling thorns tear through my jacket and into my skin. The Wendigo was close enough now that I could smell its breath, like rotting meat and winter wind. "David loved you, you know," it said, its voice gentle and almost kind. "In those last moments before I consumed him, he was thinking about you, about all the adventures you'd shared, all the plans you'd made. He wanted me to tell you that he was sorry." The creature reached out with one clawed hand and touched my cheek almost tenderly. Its skin was cold as January frost and rough like tree bark. "I can let you speak with him," it offered. "I still carry pieces of him inside me, fragments of his memories, echoes of his personality. If you join me, if you let me transform you, you can be with your friend forever." For a moment I was tempted. The hunger was so strong now that it was hard to think about anything else. And the loneliness. When was the last time I'd felt truly connected to another person? David had been my closest friend, and now I knew that the David I'd mourned had been dead for years. But then I remembered something David had told me on that first night, when he'd thought he'd heard his name being called. The real David, before the Wendigo had consumed him completely. "You were probably dreaming," I'd said. But he hadn't been dreaming. He'd been fighting. Even as the creature was devouring his body and absorbing his memories, some part of the real David had been trying to warn me. I grabbed a handful of the hard-packed earth from the ground and threw it into the Wendigo's eyes. As it recoiled with a shriek of pain and rage, I noticed something crucial. Where my handful of dirt had struck the creature's face, the borrowed features of David began to melt away, revealing the gray-white bone beneath. The clearing might exist outside normal space, but it was still subject to certain rules. The Wendigo's power came from its connection to this cursed ground, and the earth itself was part of its essence. I began to dig. My fingernails tore and bled as I clawed at the hard-packed dirt, but I could feel something beneath the surface, something that didn't belong. The Wendigo realized what I was doing and lunged toward me with a roar of fury, but I rolled aside and kept digging. My fingers found it first. A smooth, round object buried about 2 feet down. As I pulled it free, I saw that it was a skull, human, but wrong in subtle ways. The eye sockets were too large, the jaw too elongated, the teeth filed to sharp points. "No," the Wendigo whispered, its voice filled with terror for the first time. "You don't understand what you're doing." But I did understand. This was the creature's original form, the human it had been before the hunger transformed it into something monstrous. Its power was anchored to this place by its remains, and if I could destroy them... I smashed the skull against the base of the dead tree. It cracked but didn't break, and the Wendigo screamed as if I'd driven a knife into its heart. All around the clearing, the hanging bodies began to writhe and moan, as if the creature's pain was waking them from some terrible sleep. The second blow split the skull in half. The third reduced it to fragments. The Wendigo collapsed, its borrowed form of David dissolving like smoke. The massive trees that had formed the walls of the clearing began to groan and sway, and suddenly the forest was alive with sound again. Birds calling, insects buzzing, wind rustling through leaves. I looked around and saw that the clearing was no longer perfectly circular. Plants were already beginning to sprout through cracks in the hard-packed earth. The dead tree was showing tiny green buds on its branches, and the pile of abandoned camping gear was crumbling to dust as if decades of decay were happening in moments. The path out of the clearing was clearly visible now, marked by blazes cut into tree bark. I stumbled toward it on legs that barely supported my weight, driven by an overwhelming need to put distance between myself and this cursed place. I hiked for 2 days through familiar forest, following established trails that appeared on GPS maps. When I finally reached the parking area where David and I had left his car, I found a team of park rangers organizing a search party. "Michael Williams," one of them asked when he saw me emerge from the tree line. "You've been missing for 6 days. Where's your friend David Jones?" 6 days. I'd thought it had been 3 at most, but the rangers insisted I'd been reported missing nearly a week ago. And David, how could I explain that the David they were looking for had been dead for 5 years, consumed by a creature that had been wearing his identity like a mask? In the end, I told them that David had fallen into a ravine and I couldn't recover his body. The location was too remote, too dangerous. The search team made several attempts to find the clearing I described, but they never succeeded. The GPS coordinates I gave them led to solid forest with no sign of the cursed circle of dead earth. Sometimes I wonder if the clearing ever really existed, or if it only manifests when the Wendigo needs to feed. I've researched the name David Jones extensively, looking for evidence of his disappearance 5 years ago. I found a missing person report filed in 2020 for a David Jones who'd gone solo hiking in Pisgah National Forest and never returned. The description matched my friend perfectly. I also found records of 8 other hikers who'd disappeared in that region over the past 5 years. 7 of them had been reported missing while hiking with David Jones. I never went back to the woods. I moved to Florida 6 months later, as far from the mountains as I could get. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear David's voice calling my name. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see my teeth growing longer and sharper. The hunger is still there, waiting, growing stronger. I've been writing this account not as a warning, but as a confession. Because I've realized something terrible. The Wendigo didn't die when I destroyed its skull. It simply found a new host. The real Michael Williams has been dead for 6 days, and I'm so very, very hungry. My name is Christopher Hernandez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Linville Gorge, North Carolina, 3 months ago. I'm writing this down because the doctors say it might help with the nightmares, but I know the truth. Some things can't be healed with therapy and medication. Some things follow you home. Brandon Edwards had been my best friend since college. We'd hiked dozens of trails together across the Blue Ridge Mountains, but he'd been pushing for something more challenging lately. "We're getting soft, Chris," he'd said over beers at his apartment in Asheville. "When's the last time we did something that actually scared us?" Amanda Wright was Brandon's girlfriend of 2 years, a tough-as-nails emergency room nurse who could suture a wound blindfolded but had never been on a serious backcountry hike. Brandon convinced her to join us with promises of spectacular views and just a little adventure. I should have known better. I should have recognized the hunger in his eyes when he talked about pushing our limits. The plan was simple: 3 days and 2 nights in the Linville Gorge Wilderness area, following the unofficial trail that descended into what locals called the Devil's Bathtub, a series of deep pools carved into ancient granite by millennia of rushing water. The area was notorious for its unpredictable weather, treacherous rock faces, and the way hikers seemed to vanish without explanation. Perfect, according to Brandon. We started our descent on a Friday morning in late October. The autumn air carried that crisp bite that promised winter wasn't far behind, and the forest canopy blazed with reds and golds that should have been beautiful. Instead, something about the colors seemed too vivid, too intense, like looking at the world through a fever dream. "Jesus, it's gorgeous out here," Amanda said, adjusting her pack straps. She'd bought all new gear for the trip, a pristine REI setup that screamed beginner. Brandon had insisted she didn't need much experience for this hike, but watching her struggle with the weight distribution made my stomach clench with worry. "Wait until you see the gorge itself," Brandon replied, his voice carrying that evangelical fervor he got whenever he talked about extreme hiking. "It's like stepping into another world, completely untouched wilderness." The first sign something was wrong came about an hour into our descent. My GPS watch, which had been working perfectly that morning, started displaying impossible coordinates, numbers that placed us somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. When I mentioned it to Brandon, he just laughed. "Technology fails out here all the time," he said. "That's what makes it real wilderness. We've got the paper map." But when he pulled out the topographical map we'd studied for weeks, the lines seemed different somehow. Not dramatically, just subtle shifts in the contour lines that made the terrain appear more complex, more maze-like than I remembered. I chalked it up to my imagination and the disorienting effect of being surrounded by towering trees that blocked most of the sky. Amanda was struggling more than she'd admitted she would. By midday, when we stopped for lunch beside a creek that wasn't marked on our map, her face was flushed and she was breathing hard. The sound of the water was wrong, too. Instead of the cheerful babbling you'd expect from a mountain stream, it had a deep, throaty quality that reminded me of something choking. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, trying to keep my voice casual. "Give Amanda a chance to work up to this kind of terrain." "I'm fine," she snapped, but I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. "I didn't come all this way to turn around at the first sign of difficulty." Brandon shot me a look that clearly said, "Back off," so I dropped it. That was my first mistake. Not trusting my instincts when they were screaming at me that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The afternoon brought an unseasonable fog that seemed to rise from the ground itself rather than drifting down from the mountains. It carried a smell I couldn't identify, something organic and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and our breath began misting even though my watch insisted it was still 68 degrees. "This weather doesn't make sense," Amanda said, pulling on her jacket. "The forecast called for clear skies all weekend." "Mountain weather's unpredictable," Brandon replied, but I caught the uncertainty in his voice. He'd been checking his phone every few minutes, cursing under his breath when he couldn't get a signal. We made camp that evening in a small clearing beside what our map identified as Grandfather Creek. The name should have been our second warning. Local legends spoke of an old man who lived in these woods, not a hermit or a trapper, but something older and hungrier that wore human shape when it suited him. Setting up the tents proved more difficult than it should have. The ground was soft and marshy despite the recent dry spell, and our stakes wouldn't hold properly. Every time we thought we had the rainfly secured, a gust of wind would tear it loose again. The wind itself was wrong. It seemed to blow from multiple directions simultaneously, creating an eerie whistling sound that set my teeth on edge. "There," Brandon said finally, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "Should hold for the night." But I noticed he was checking the guy lines obsessively, as if he didn't quite trust his own work. Amanda had barely spoken since we'd started making camp, and when she did talk, her voice had a distant quality that made me want to check if she was running a fever. Dinner was a subdued affair. Our camping stove wouldn't stay lit properly. The flame kept changing from blue to green to an unsettling reddish color that gave off almost no heat. We ended up eating cold food and drinking water that tasted faintly of copper despite being filtered. None of us mentioned how the darkness seemed to press against our small circle of LED lantern light like a living thing. "I keep hearing something out there," Amanda said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon and I froze, listening. The normal forest sounds, owl calls, rustling leaves, the distant yip of coyotes, were completely absent. Instead, there was a rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, coming from multiple directions around our camp. "Probably just the wind," Brandon said, but his hand moved instinctively to the bear spray clipped to his belt. The breathing sound continued for another minute, then stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical weight. Amanda shivered and moved closer to our pathetic excuse for a campfire. "I don't like this place," she admitted. "Something feels wrong, like we're being watched." I wanted to agree with her, to suggest we pack up immediately and hike out by headlamp, but Brandon's expression had turned stubborn. He'd spent months planning this trip, and his pride wouldn't let him admit that maybe we were in over our heads. "It's just the isolation getting to you," he said. "First time in real wilderness can be overwhelming. You'll feel better in the morning." But Amanda didn't look convinced, and neither was I. The feeling of being observed was so strong I could almost feel eyes on the back of my neck. Several times I spun around, expecting to see something lurking just beyond the edge of our light, but there was never anything there. We took turns keeping watch that night, though none of us admitted that's what we were doing. Brandon took first shift, sitting by the dying embers of our fire and staring out into the impenetrable darkness. When he woke me at midnight, his hands were shaking. "Everything okay?" I whispered. "Fine," he replied, but his eyes kept darting toward the tree line. "Just stay alert, okay?" My shift passed without incident, unless you counted the way the shadows seemed to move independently of any wind, or the distant sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. When I woke Amanda at 3 a.m., she was already sitting up in her sleeping bag, wide awake. "Couldn't sleep either?" I asked. She shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I feel like something's going to grab me." The rest of the night crawled by with agonizing slowness. Dawn, when it finally came, arrived gray and muted, filtered through a fog so thick we could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Our breakfast was interrupted by the discovery that half our food had spoiled overnight. Vacuum-sealed packets that should have lasted for days were covered in a gray-green mold that stank of decay. "That's impossible," Brandon said, holding up a package of freeze-dried meals. "These things are supposed to last for years." But there it was, undeniable evidence that something was seriously wrong. We were left with enough food for maybe one more day, assuming we rationed carefully. "We should head back," I said. "Cut our losses and get out while we still can." "No." Brandon's voice was sharp with frustration. "We're only 6 hours from the Devil's Bathtub. We came here to see it, and that's what we're going to do." Amanda looked torn between supporting her boyfriend and listening to her own survival instincts. In the end, loyalty won out. "One more day," she agreed reluctantly. "But if anything else goes wrong, we're leaving immediately." That should have been the end of it. We should have packed up and hiked out that morning, while we still had our health and our sanity. But Brandon had that look in his eyes, the same expression I'd seen when he'd convinced me to free climb a cliff face in Tennessee, or when he'd talked me into taking a raft down Classify Rapids in Georgia. He needed to prove something to himself, and he wasn't going to let common sense get in the way. The hike that morning was a nightmare. The fog never lifted, forcing us to navigate by compass alone through terrain that seemed to shift and change when we weren't looking directly at it. Trails that had been clearly marked the day before simply vanished, replaced by impenetrable thickets of mountain laurel and rhododendron. Our compass began spinning wildly, pointing in different directions every time we checked it. "Technology," Brandon muttered, but his confidence was starting to crack. Amanda was moving like a sleepwalker, putting one foot in front of the other with mechanical precision but showing no awareness of her surroundings. When I tried to talk to her, she'd respond with single-word answers or just nod absently. More troubling, she'd started walking off the trail at random intervals, heading straight into the brush until one of us grabbed her arm and redirected her. "She's altitude sick," Brandon explained when I voiced my concerns. "Happens to some people, even at relatively low elevations. She'll be fine once we get back to civilization." But we weren't at high altitude. Linville Gorge sat at barely 3,000 feet above sea level, and Amanda's symptoms didn't match any case of altitude sickness I'd ever heard of. She wasn't nauseous or dizzy, she was just absent, like something essential had been drained out of her during the night. We reached the Devil's Bathtub around noon, though the fog was still so thick we could barely make out the rock formations that gave the place its name. The pools of water were there, carved deep into granite that looked almost black in the limited light, but something about them made my skin crawl. The water was perfectly still, like dark glass, and it reflected nothing. Not the sky, not our faces, nothing at all. "It's incredible," Brandon breathed, and for a moment his earlier enthusiasm returned. "Look at the way the rock's been carved. Thousands of years of erosion, creating these perfect basins." But there was nothing perfect about this place. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even our voices seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. And there was a smell, faint but persistent, like something had died here long ago and never properly decomposed. Amanda had wandered to the edge of the largest pool and was staring down into the black water with an expression I couldn't read. When I called her name, she didn't respond. When I touched her shoulder, she flinched away as if I'd burned her. "Don't," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "It doesn't like to be disturbed." "What doesn't like to be disturbed?" I asked. But she just shook her head and continued staring into the water. Brandon was too busy taking photos to notice Amanda's behavior, though I noticed his camera wasn't working properly either. The digital display kept flickering, showing impossible images, faces in the rock, shadows that moved independently, and in one particularly disturbing shot, what looked like something large and pale floating just beneath the surface of the largest pool. We ate lunch in uncomfortable silence, sharing our meager remaining supplies while the fog pressed around us like a living thing. I kept checking my watch, but the display seemed frozen. The hands hadn't moved in over an hour. Stuck at 12:34 p.m. "We need to start heading back," I finally said. "If we leave now, we can make it to the car before dark." "Just a little longer," Brandon replied. "I want to get some more shots when the fog lifts." But the fog showed no signs of lifting. If anything, it was getting thicker, reducing our visibility to just a few feet. And Amanda's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. She'd started humming under her breath, a tuneless, monotonous sound that made my teeth ache. When Brandon tried to take her picture, she recoiled as if the camera was a weapon. "Don't," she said again, and this time there was something in her voice that made both Brandon and me step back. "It sees through the lens. It doesn't want to be seen." "Amanda, you're scaring me," Brandon said. "What are you talking about?" But she'd already turned away, walking toward the tree line with that same mechanical gait she'd displayed all morning. We followed, calling her name, but she ignored us completely. She stopped beside a massive oak tree that must have been centuries old, its trunk scarred with what looked like claw marks. "It's time," she said simply, and then she was gone. Not gone as in she'd run away or hidden behind the tree. Gone as in she'd simply vanished, like she'd never been there at all. One moment she was standing 3 feet away from us. The next, there was only empty air and the lingering scent of something rotten. "Amanda!" Brandon screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Amanda!" We searched for hours, calling her name until our throats were raw, but it was like looking for a ghost. There were no footprints, no broken branches, no sign that she'd ever existed. The fog seemed to muffle our voices, making it impossible to tell how far our calls were carrying or if anyone, anything, was listening. As the afternoon wore on, Brandon became increasingly frantic. He started making wild accusations that I'd done something to her, that this was all some elaborate prank, that we were in the wrong location entirely. When I suggested we hike out and get help from the rangers, he flew into a rage. "We're not leaving without her," he snarled. "She's out there somewhere, probably hurt and scared, and you want to abandon her?" But I was starting to suspect that whatever had happened to Amanda was beyond the help of park rangers or search and rescue teams. This place had taken her, and I had the terrible feeling it wasn't done with us yet. We made camp again that night, though calling it camp was generous. Without Amanda's tent and supplies, we were forced to share Brandon's 2-person shelter, huddled together for warmth while the temperature plummeted far below what any weather service had predicted. Our remaining food was gone, not spoiled this time, but simply missing, along with most of our water. Brandon refused to sleep, spending the entire night calling Amanda's name into the darkness. I dozed fitfully, jerked awake repeatedly by sounds that shouldn't exist. Footsteps circling our tent, whispered conversations and voices that weren't quite human. And once, unmistakably, Amanda's laughter coming from somewhere high above us in the trees. Dawn brought no relief. The fog was thicker than ever, and our attempts to retrace our steps led us in circles. Every path looked the same. Every tree seemed familiar, yet wrong, and our compass spun like a roulette wheel. Worse, Brandon was starting to show signs of whatever had affected Amanda. He'd begun talking to himself, carrying on conversations with someone who wasn't there, and his eyes had developed a glassy, unfocused quality that made my skin crawl. "She's calling to me," he said around midday, stopping abruptly on what might have been a trail. "Can't you hear her?" I couldn't hear anything except the oppressive silence that had blanketed the forest since our arrival. But Brandon cocked his head as if listening to something specific, then started walking off in a direction that led straight into a tangle of deadfall and thorns. "Brandon." "Wait," I called, but he was already disappearing into the underbrush. I followed, fighting my way through branches that seemed designed to tear at exposed skin, leaving bloody scratches on my arms and face. The vegetation was wrong here, twisted into unnatural shapes with leaves that were too dark and bark that felt oily to the touch. Some of the trees appeared to be growing in spirals, their trunks corkscrewing up toward the hidden sky in patterns that hurt to look at directly. I caught up with Brandon in a clearing I was certain hadn't existed moments before. He was standing perfectly still, staring at something I couldn't see, his face slack with an expression of terrible longing. "She's so beautiful," he whispered. "Why didn't I ever notice how beautiful she is?" "Brandon, there's nothing there," I said, grabbing his arm. "We need to get out of here, now." But when he turned to look at me, his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire orb, like looking into deep water at night. When he smiled, his teeth seemed sharper than they should be, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made him look like a corpse. "She's waiting for us," he said in a voice that was almost but not quite his own. "Down in the deep places where the old things sleep. She wants us to join her." That's when I ran. I crashed through the forest like a panicked animal, branches tearing at my clothes and face, roots catching my feet and sending me tumbling into patches of thorns. Behind me, I could hear Brandon calling my name, but his voice was wrong. Too deep, too resonant, like it was coming from somewhere much larger than a human throat. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing beside a stream that I prayed was the same one we'd camped by on our first night. The water was running backward, flowing uphill toward its source, and it reflected my face with features that weren't quite right. Eyes too wide, mouth too large, skin with a greenish tint that spoke of something diseased. That's when I heard the singing. It started low and soft, drifting through the fog like a lullaby, but there was something inherently wrong with the melody. The notes seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly in my bones and making my teeth ache. It was definitely Amanda's voice, but changed somehow. Older, hungrier, with harmonics that suggested other voices singing along just below the threshold of hearing. "Christopher," the voice called, sweet as honey and twice as dangerous. "Christopher, where are you? We've been looking everywhere for you." I pressed myself against a fallen log and tried to control my breathing. The singing was getting closer, accompanied by the sound of footsteps that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Through the fog, I could see shapes moving. Tall, pale figures that might have been human if you didn't look too closely at the way their limbs bent or the way they seemed to glide rather than walk. "We're so cold down here," Amanda's voice continued, now coming from directly above me. "So lonely. Won't you come and warm us up?" I looked up through the canopy and saw her hanging upside down from a tree branch, her neck twisted at an impossible angle, her black eyes fixed on mine with predatory intensity. She was smiling, that too wide smile, and her skin had the same grayish pallor I'd seen on Brandon's face. "There you are," she said, and dropped. I rolled aside just as she hit the ground with a wet thud that no living person should have been able to survive. But she simply stood up, brushing leaves from her hair as if nothing had happened, and turned to face me with that horrible smile. "Brandon's been asking for you," she said conversationally. "He's so excited to show you what we found down in the deep places. Such wonderful, hungry things, sleeping in the dark." Behind her, more figures emerged from the fog. Brandon, but not Brandon. his features subtly altered in ways that transformed familiarity into something nightmarish. And others too, hikers and campers who'd probably vanished from these woods over the years, all wearing that same black-eyed expression of terrible contentment. "The old ones have been sleeping for so long," Amanda continued, taking a step closer. "But they're starting to wake up now. And they're so hungry. Christopher, they need fresh meat, fresh blood, fresh souls to sustain them through the long winter ahead." I scrambled backward, my hand closing around a sharp piece of deadfall. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. "You can't fight them," Amanda said, reading my thoughts. "They've been here since before the mountains rose, since before the first humans walked on two legs. They shaped this place, molded it to their needs. Every trail leads back to them. Every path circles back to the feeding grounds." "What do you want?" I managed to ask through a throat gone dry with terror. "We want you to join us," she replied, "to become part of the collective, to feed the old ones as we have fed them. It doesn't hurt, Christopher. After the first few minutes, you won't feel anything at all." The thing that had been Brandon stepped forward, its movements unnaturally fluid. "It's really quite pleasant," it said in his voice, "like drowning in warm honey. All your pain just goes away." They were surrounding me now, a circle of possessed hikers moving with predatory coordination. I could see more shapes in the fog, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all with those same black eyes and terrible smiles. "Last chance," Amanda said, extending one hand toward me. Her fingers were too long now, ending in points that weren't quite claws but were definitely sharp enough to tear flesh. "Come willingly, and we'll make it quick. Force us to take you, and we'll make it last for days." That's when I noticed the piece of deadfall in my hand wasn't wood at all. It was bone, yellowed with age and carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. The moment my fingers closed around it, the possessed hikers all took a step back, their confident expressions replaced by something that might have been fear. "Impossible," the Brandon thing hissed. "The old protections were broken decades ago." But apparently they weren't all broken. The bone felt warm in my hand, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. When I held it up, the fog around us began to thin, revealing the true extent of the nightmare I'd stumbled into. We weren't in a forest anymore. We were in a vast cavern, its walls carved with the same shifting symbols that decorated the bone. The trees were actually massive pillars of some dark stone, and what I'd taken for leaves were actually clusters of something that looked disturbingly like preserved human skin. The ground beneath my feet wasn't earth, but compacted bone meal, and the air reeked of centuries of decay. At the center of it all, in what had appeared to be the devil's bathtub, something vast and pale was stirring in the depths. I caught glimpses of it through the dark water, tentacles thick as tree trunks, eyes like dying stars, and a mouth that could have swallowed a school bus. This was what they wanted to feed me to, what they'd been feeding victims to for longer than human civilization had existed. "You cannot leave," Amanda said, but her voice was smaller now, less certain. "The ways are sealed. The paths all lead back here." "Maybe," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "But this bone says otherwise." I'd studied enough anthropology in college to recognize indigenous protective charms when I saw them. Some Native American shaman had carved this centuries ago, imbuing it with power specifically designed to combat whatever ancient evil had made its home in these mountains. The question was whether that power was still strong enough to get me out alive. There was only one way to find out. I pressed the bone against my forehead and spoke the only words that came to mind. Not English, not Spanish, but something older that seemed to rise from some deep genetic memory. The possessed hikers screamed in unison, a sound like breaking glass and dying animals, and the thing in the pool thrashed so violently that waves of black water splashed against the cavern walls. The world around me began to dissolve, reality reasserting itself in painful fits and starts. The stone pillars became trees again, the bone meal became forest floor, and the oppressive weight of ancient evil lifted enough for me to breathe freely for the first time in 3 days. But the possessed hikers were still there, still circling, still smiling those terrible smiles. "Clever," Amanda said, "but protective charms only work for so long, and we have all the time in the world." She was right, of course. The bone was warm in my hand, but I could feel its power ebbing like a battery running down. In minutes, maybe less, I'd be defenseless again. Unless... I looked at the Brandon thing and made a decision that still haunts my dreams. "Brandon," I said, focusing on what remained of my friend somewhere inside that corrupted shell. "I know you're still in there. Fight it. Remember who you are." For just a moment, the black eyes flickered, revealing a flash of brown underneath. His mouth moved, forming words in his own voice. "Run." That was all the opening I needed. I drove the bone deep into his chest, feeling it pierce whatever unholy essence had taken root there. He screamed. They all screamed, and the sound was so piercing that blood ran from my ears. The Brandon thing collapsed, black ichor pouring from the wound instead of blood. The other possessed hikers recoiled as if they'd been burned, giving me a clear path to what looked like it might be an actual trail. I ran again, clutching the bone as its power continued to fade. Behind me, the screaming gradually subsided, replaced by Amanda's voice calling my name with renewed hunger. They were following, but slowly now, as if the death of one of their number had made them more cautious. The trail led up and out, winding through terrain that looked almost normal in the pale morning light. My watch started working again, showing me that somehow 3 full days had passed since we'd entered the gorge. My phone flickered to life, displaying 17 missed calls from search and rescue teams who'd been looking for us since we'd failed to check in. I reached the parking area just as the first ranger vehicle pulled up, its occupants rushing to meet me with medical supplies and worried expressions. They found me babbling about possessed hikers and ancient evils, clutching a piece of carved bone and covered in scratches that spelled out symbols I couldn't read. The official report lists Amanda Wright and Brandon Edwards as missing, presumed dead due to exposure and difficult terrain. Search teams combed Linville Gorge for weeks, but found no trace of either body. The bone disappeared from the ranger station's evidence locker 3 days after I turned it in, though no one could explain how. I spent 2 weeks in a psychiatric facility, being treated for severe dehydration, exposure, and what the doctors diplomatically termed stress-related hallucinations. They gave me medication for the nightmares and referred me to a therapist who specializes in trauma recovery. But I know what I saw down there. I know what took my friends, and I know it's still waiting in those woods for the next group of hikers foolish enough to venture into its territory. The protective charm I found was probably left by the last person to escape, and there's no guarantee there will be another one when the next victims need it. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear Amanda's voice calling my name. Sometimes I see Brandon's face in crowds wearing that same terrible smile. The doctors say these are just manifestations of survivors' guilt, but I know better. They're still down there, in the deep places where the old things sleep, and they're still hungry. I've tried to warn people, posted on hiking forums, called the Park Service, even reached out to paranormal investigators. But who believes stories like mine? I'm just another trauma victim with a fantastic tale about monsters in the woods. So I'm writing this down, leaving a record for whoever finds it. Maybe it will help the next person who stumbles across something they shouldn't have found. Maybe it will save a life. Or maybe it won't. Maybe the old ones will keep feeding, keep growing stronger until they're ready to emerge from their hiding places and reclaim a world they ruled long before humanity drew its first breath. All I know for certain is this. If you're planning to hike in Linville Gorge, don't. Find somewhere else to test your limits. Find somewhere else to prove your courage, because some places are hungry, and some hungers are never satisfied. My name is Christopher Hernandez, and I am the only survivor of what happened in Linville Gorge 3 months ago. I'm telling you this story because I need you to understand. When the old protective barriers start failing, when ancient evils begin to stir, running isn't cowardice. Sometimes it's the only sane response to something that should never have existed at all. But even now, as I write these final words, I can hear something scratching at my window. Something that sounds like fingernails on glass, played in a rhythm that almost sounds like my name. They found me. God help me, they found me, and I don't have any more protective charms to keep them away. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Grandfather Mountain, North Carolina, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip with my best friend Jake. I should have known something was wrong the moment our phones died simultaneously. Jake Morrison and I had been planning this trip for months. We both worked soul-crushing office jobs in Charlotte, and the idea of disconnecting from civilization for a long weekend felt like exactly what we needed. The Blue Ridge Mountains in late October promised spectacular foliage, crisp air, and the kind of solitude that only comes from venturing deep into the Pisgah National Forest. "You sure about this trail?" Jake asked as we shouldered our packs at the Grandfather Mountain trailhead. The parking area was empty except for our Jeep, which should have been our first warning. Even the most remote trails usually had at least one other vehicle on a Friday afternoon. I checked the map one more time, tracing our planned route with my finger. Profile trail to Callaway Peak, then we'll set up camp near the old fire tower ruins. From there, we can explore some of the unmarked trails tomorrow. The paper crinkled in the mountain wind, and I noticed my hands were already numb despite my gloves. Jake nodded, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. At 31, he was 2 years older than me but looked younger, his boyish face always quick to smile. We'd been friends since college, bonded by our shared love of horror movies and outdoor adventures. He was the optimist to my pessimist, the one who always pushed us to try new things while I worried about every possible outcome. That dynamic had served us well over the years, but as we started up the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that my usual caution should have kept us home. The first hour of hiking was perfect. The trail was well marked, winding through dense stands of Fraser fir and red spruce. The autumn colors were even more spectacular than the photos online had promised, brilliant oranges and deep reds painting the mountainside in broad strokes. Jake kept stopping to take pictures with his phone, making jokes about his Instagram followers not believing how ruggedly handsome he looked against the wilderness backdrop. "You know," he said during one of his photo sessions, "this is exactly what I needed. Sarah's been driving me crazy with wedding planning. Sometimes I think she cares more about the perfect centerpieces than actually marrying me." I laughed, but the sound felt hollow in the vast emptiness around us. Jake had been with Sarah for 3 years, and while I liked her well enough, I'd always sensed something forced about their relationship. Like they were together because it was expected, not because they couldn't imagine life without each other. "Maybe she just wants everything to be perfect," I offered, adjusting my pack straps. The weight was already starting to dig into my shoulders. "Yeah, maybe." Jake's expression grew distant for a moment, then he shook his head and grinned. "Whatever. That's a problem for Monday, Jake. Weekend Jake is free as a bird." That was the last normal conversation we had. The change started gradually, so subtly that I almost missed it. First, the bird sounds faded away. I didn't notice immediately because Jake and I were talking, our voices echoing off the rocky trail. But as we climbed higher, our conversation naturally lulled, and that's when the silence hit me. Complete, absolute silence. No wind in the trees, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no distant calls of ravens or hawks. Even our footsteps seemed muffled as if the mountain itself was absorbing every sound. "Jake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "do you notice anything different?" He stopped and cocked his head, listening. For a long moment we stood perfectly still. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water pressure. "Weird," he finally said, but his tone was casual, unconcerned. Maybe we're just too high for most wildlife. I wanted to point out that we were only about 4,000 feet up, nowhere near the tree line, but something made me keep my mouth shut. Instead, I checked my phone to see if I could look up typical wildlife ranges for this elevation. The screen was black. I pressed the power button. Nothing. I held it down for 10 seconds. Still nothing. "My phone's dead," I said. Pulling it out to show Jake. He was already reaching for his own phone. "Mine too. That's impossible. I charged it to full this morning, and it was working fine an hour ago." We stood there staring at our dead devices like they might spontaneously resurrect themselves. 2 phones, different brands, different charge levels, dying at exactly the same time. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Extreme cold, altitude, electromagnetic interference from the mountain's granite composition. But a deeper, more primitive part of my brain was already screaming warnings. "It's probably just the cold," Jake said, though he sounded less convinced than before. "Let's keep moving. We need to make camp before dark." The trail continued to climb, switchbacking up the mountain's eastern face. According to my paper map, we should reach the fire tower ruins within another hour. But as we hiked, I started to notice other things that weren't quite right. The trees were wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The species were correct for this elevation: Fraser fir, red spruce, a few mountain ash trees scattered throughout. But their arrangement felt off, like someone had planted them according to an alien logic. They grew in strange patterns, clusters of 7 or 9 trees with perfect spacing between them, forming rough circles that reminded me uncomfortably of ritual sites. And the bark on many of the trees was scarred, not from natural causes like woodpecker holes or storm damage, but in deliberate patterns. Long parallel gouges that ran from about 3 feet off the ground up to 7 or 8 feet, as if something large with claws had been marking territory. "Bear scratches," Jake said when I pointed them out, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Bears don't scratch that high," I said, "and look at the spacing of the claw marks. What is claws that long?" Jake didn't answer. He was staring at one of the marked trees, his face pale beneath his knit cap. The gouges in the bark were deep, cutting through to the pale wood beneath. But that wasn't what made my stomach clench with dread. It was the fact that the scratches were fresh. Sap was still weeping from the wounds, dark and sticky in the fading afternoon light. Something had made these marks recently, maybe even while we were on the trail. The temperature was dropping faster than it should have, even for late October in the mountains. My breath came in thick clouds, and the moisture was starting to freeze on my beard. Jake's lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and I could see him shivering despite his heavy jacket. "We need to find shelter soon," I said, consulting the map again. The paper felt brittle in my hands, the edges crackling with frost. The fire tower should be just ahead. But when we crested the next ridge, there was nothing. No ruins, no fire tower, no clearing where one might have stood. Just more trees, more of those unsettling circular patterns, more fresh claw marks on the bark. I checked the map again, then looked around for landmarks. We should have been at the tower. The elevation was right, the direction was right, but the forest stretched on endlessly, as if the ruins had never existed. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Jake suggested, but I could hear the growing panic in his voice. "There was only one trail," I said. "We couldn't have gotten lost." But even as I said it, I realized that wasn't true anymore. Looking back the way we'd come, I couldn't see the trail. The path that had been clearly marked for the past 3 hours had simply vanished, swallowed by the forest as if it had never been there at all. The rational explanations were crumbling. Weather doesn't change this fast. Phones don't die simultaneously without cause. Trails don't disappear. But the evidence of my senses was undeniable. We were lost in a place that shouldn't exist, following a path that was no longer there. "We're setting up camp here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now, before it gets any darker." Jake nodded, his teeth chattering audibly. We found what looked like a suitable spot in a small clearing, though even the clearing felt wrong. Too perfectly circular, too evenly spaced from the surrounding trees. As I started unpacking our tent, I noticed that the temperature had dropped so far that my breath was crystallizing instantly, forming tiny ice particles that tinkled when they hit the ground. That should have been impossible. We were in North Carolina, not the Arctic. "Mike," Jake's voice was tight with fear, "look at the trees." I followed his gaze and felt my blood turn to ice water. The scarred trees around our clearing were moving, not swaying in the wind. There was no wind. They were shifting position, rotating slowly like clock hands, always keeping their marked sides facing toward us, watching us. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating from altitude and cold, but when I opened my eyes, the trees had moved again. Closer. "We need to get out of here," Jake whispered. "And go where?" I gestured at the forest around us. "The trail is gone. Our GPS is dead. It's almost dark and the temperature is dropping below zero." Jake stared at me, his eyes wide with panic. "So, what do we do?" Before I could answer, we heard the sound. It started low, almost below the range of human hearing, a subsonic rumble that seemed to come from deep underground. But it rose quickly, climbing the scale until it became a howl unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was definitely not human, but it wasn't quite animal either. It had an intelligence to it, a deliberate quality that suggested consciousness and intent. And it was close. The howl cut off abruptly, leaving us in that oppressive silence again. Jake and I stood frozen, barely breathing, waiting for something else to happen. That's when I smelled it. The stench hit us like a physical blow, the overwhelming reek of rotting meat and old blood, mixed with something else, something that reminded me of the smell when you walk past a house where someone has died and the body hasn't been found for weeks. "Jesus Christ," Jake gagged, pulling his shirt up over his nose and mouth. The smell was getting stronger, which meant whatever was producing it was getting closer. I grabbed Jake's arm and pointed toward what looked like a denser patch of trees on the far side of the clearing. "Hide," I whispered. We crept toward the tree line, trying to be as quiet as possible. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure the sound would give us away. Behind us, I could hear something moving through the forest. Something large and heavy, but moving with unnatural stealth. We reached the trees and pressed ourselves against the largest trunk we could find. Through the gaps in the branches, I had a clear view of our abandoned campsite. It stepped into the clearing. I've seen a lot of horror movies. I've read Stephen King and Clive Barker and every other master of the macabre, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of seeing something that shouldn't exist. It had been human once. That was the most horrifying part. I could see the remnants of humanity in its basic shape. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head, but everything was wrong, stretched and twisted into something nightmare. It stood at least 8 feet tall, but unnaturally thin, as if someone had grabbed a person by the head and feet and pulled until their body elongated like taffy. Its skin was a sickly gray-white, pulled tight over bones that jutted out at impossible angles. But the worst part was the face. Its features were human but exaggerated to grotesque proportions. The mouth stretched almost from ear to ear, filled with teeth that were too long, too sharp, stained dark with old blood. The eyes were massive, taking up most of its face, but they were completely black. No iris, no pupil, just endless darkness that seemed to absorb light. And it was sniffing. Its head moved back and forth like a bloodhound following a scent trail. It knew we were here somewhere. The only question was how long before it found us. I heard Jake's breathing becoming more rapid beside me, the quick, shallow pants of someone on the verge of hyperventilating. I pressed my hand against his back, trying to remind him to stay calm, to stay quiet. The creature moved with impossible fluidity, its elongated limbs flowing like water as it circled our abandoned camping gear. It picked up my backpack and brought it to its face, inhaling deeply. Then it turned and looked directly at our hiding spot. It smiled. That smile was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Too wide, too knowing, filled with anticipation and hunger. It had found us, and it was taking its time because it enjoyed the fear. "Run," I whispered to Jake. We exploded out of our hiding spot, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. Behind us, I heard that awful howling again, but this time it sounded almost like laughter. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to have no meaning in that forest. We might have been running for minutes or hours. All I knew was the burn in my lungs, the ache in my legs, and the terrible certainty that the thing was behind us, following at its own leisurely pace. Finally, Jake collapsed. Can't run anymore," he gasped, clutching his side. I looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, somewhere defensible. We were in another clearing, this one smaller than the first, but it had something the other hadn't: a large rock formation on one side, creating a partial shelter. "There," I said, pointing toward the rocks. We stumbled over and pressed ourselves into the deepest recess we could find. It wasn't much protection, but it was better than being caught in the open. As we huddled together, trying to catch our breath, I became aware of how cold it had gotten. My fingers were numb despite my gloves, and I could feel ice crystals forming in my beard. Jake was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so loudly I was afraid the sound would give us away. "What was that thing?" he whispered. I'd been asking myself the same question. Growing up in rural North Carolina, I'd heard all the local legends, stories about strange creatures in the mountains, things that lived in the deep woods where humans rarely ventured. Most of them were just campfire stories, tall tales told to scare tourists. But one story kept coming back to me. Something my grandfather had told me when I was 12, during a camping trip in these same mountains. He'd made me promise never to repeat it, said some stories were too dangerous to spread around. It was about the Wendigo. According to legend, a Wendigo was a human who had resorted to cannibalism and been transformed into something monstrous as punishment. They were eternally hungry, eternally hunting, driven by an insatiable need to consume human flesh. And they were said to inhabit the deepest, most remote parts of the North American wilderness. I'd dismissed it as folklore then. Now, pressed against the cold stone with that thing hunting us somewhere in the darkness, it felt like the only explanation that made sense. "Mike!" Jake's voice sounded strange, distant. I turned to look at him and felt my heart stop. His eyes were black. Not like the creature's eyes, not the deep, light-absorbing black of empty sockets. But his normal brown eyes had turned completely black, pupil and iris alike swallowed by darkness. "Jake?" I whispered. He smiled and his teeth looked different, sharper. "I'm so hungry, Mike," he said in a voice that wasn't quite his own. "So very, very hungry." I scrambled backward, pressing against the rock wall. Jake followed me, moving with that same fluid grace I'd seen in the creature. His limbs seemed to bend at impossible angles, and when he reached for me, his fingers had grown too long. "What did you do with Jake?" I demanded. The thing wearing my best friend's face tilted its head, studying me with those black, empty eyes. "Jake is still here," it said in a voice like grinding bones. "He's watching everything, feeling everything. He knows what's going to happen to you and he can't do anything to stop it." I could see tears running down Jake's face, freezing before they reached his jaw. Somewhere inside that transformed body, my friend was trapped, helpless, watching as something else controlled his actions. "Please," I whispered, "let him go." The Wendigo Jake laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "I've been so hungry for so long," it said. "Do you know what it's like to starve for decades? To feel your body consuming itself, eating its own flesh just to survive? I've been waiting in these mountains, growing weaker, until someone finally came close enough." It leaned closer, and I could smell the rot on its breath. "Your friend wandered away from your campsite while you were setting up the tent, just for a moment, just long enough for me to touch him, to slide inside his skin. He fought, but hunger always wins in the end. I realized what had happened. While I'd been struggling with the tent stakes, Jake had stepped away to relieve himself. He'd been gone for maybe 3 minutes, but that had been enough. "Jake's body is mine now," the Wendigo continued. "But I need more. One host isn't enough to satisfy the hunger. I need flesh. Fresh flesh." It lunged at me. I rolled sideways, just barely avoiding its grasping claws. The fingers that had belonged to my best friend gouged deep scratches in the rock where my head had been. I scrambled to my feet and ran again, leaving Jake's transformed body behind. But I couldn't run forever. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and the cold was sapping my strength. Worse, I had nowhere to go. The forest around me was vast and trackless, and even if I could find my way back to civilization, how could I explain what had happened to Jake? I needed a plan. I found a fallen log and crouched behind it, trying to think. The Wendigo was hunting me, but it was using Jake's body. That had to be a limitation. Jake was in good shape, but he was still human. He still had human reflexes, human limitations. And somewhere inside that possessed body, Jake was still fighting. I could use that. I heard the Wendigo approaching, moving through the forest with predatory patience. It wasn't in a hurry. It knew I couldn't escape. "Mike!" It called in Jake's voice, but with that horrible undertone of hunger. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. I promise it will be quick." I stayed silent, hidden behind my log. "I can smell your fear," it continued. "It's delicious, almost as good as the taste of fresh meat." Closer now, maybe 20 feet away. "Jake told me all about you while I was consuming his memories," the Wendigo said conversationally. "He told me about your sister." My blood turned to ice. My sister Emma had died in a car accident 3 years ago. Jake was the only person who knew how much I blamed myself for it, how I'd been supposed to drive her to the party that night but had been too drunk. She'd gone with friends instead, and their car had skidded off a mountain road. "He told me how guilty you feel," the Wendigo continued, "how you lie awake at night wondering if things would have been different if you'd made different choices. He told me you've thought about joining her." I could see it now, moving between the trees with Jake's familiar gait, but everything about its posture was wrong, predatory. "Maybe this is fate, Mike. Maybe this is your chance to stop running from your guilt." 10 feet away. "Jake forgives you, by the way. He wants me to tell you that. He doesn't blame you for any of it. Not Emma, not this. He just wants the pain to stop." 5 feet. I could see its face now. Jake's face, but with those terrible black eyes and that too wide smile. "He's begging me to make it quick," the Wendigo whispered. "Should I listen to him?" It stepped around the log and I was ready. I'd found a sharp piece of broken branch while hiding, about the length and thickness of a baseball bat. As the Wendigo reached for me with Jake's hands, I swung as hard as I could. The branch connected with the side of its head with a wet crack. Jake's body stumbled sideways, black blood streaming from the wound. But it didn't fall. Instead, it turned back to me and smiled wider. "That hurt Jake more than it hurt me," it said. "Would you like to try again?" I swung the branch again, aiming for its throat. This time, the Wendigo caught it easily in one hand. Jake's fingers had grown claws and they punched through the wood like it was paper. "My turn," it said. The backhanded blow sent me flying. I hit a tree trunk hard enough to see stars, then crashed to the ground in a heap. Every bone in my body felt broken. The Wendigo approached slowly, savoring my helplessness. "The hunger is so strong now," it said, licking its lips with a tongue that was too long, too black. "I'm going to start with your fingers, then your toes. I want to keep you alive as long as possible." I tried to crawl away, but my body wouldn't respond properly. The blow had done something to my spine, left me partially paralyzed. The Wendigo knelt beside me and grabbed my right hand. Its claws dug into my wrist, drawing blood. "Say goodbye, Mike," it said in Jake's voice. That's when I heard Jake scream. Not the Wendigo. Jake. His real voice, full of anguish and determination, coming from somewhere deep inside the possessed body. The Wendigo's grip loosened for just a moment, and I saw Jake's brown eyes flicker back to normal. "Mike," he gasped. "The fire! It hates fire!" Then the black eyes returned and the Wendigo snarled in rage. "Stupid boy," it hissed. "You'll pay for that." But Jake had given me what I needed. I still had my lighter in my pocket, and the forest around us was full of dry leaves and dead branches. With my left hand, the one the Wendigo wasn't holding, I fumbled for my lighter. My fingers were numb and clumsy, but I managed to get it out and flip it open. The Wendigo saw what I was doing and tried to grab the lighter, but I was faster. I flicked the flame to life and held it to a pile of dry leaves beside me. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The Wendigo released my hand and recoiled as if the tiny flame was a blowtorch. It backed away, making a keening sound of distress. "No," it whispered. "No fire. Please, no fire." I grabbed a burning leaf and held it up like a torch. The Wendigo retreated further, its face contorted with fear and rage. "Get out of him," I demanded. "I can't," it said. "I'm bound to this flesh now. The only way to free him is to destroy the body." I looked at Jake's face, twisted by the Wendigo's presence but still recognizably my best friend. The thought of killing him, even to save him, was unbearable. But then Jake's voice broke through again. "Do it, Mike," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I can feel it eating my soul. I won't survive much longer anyway. Please." The Wendigo tried to regain control, but the fire seemed to weaken its hold. Jake's natural personality was fighting its way to the surface. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I set fire to a larger pile of leaves and branches, creating a wall of flame between me and the Wendigo. It cowered away from the light, making that awful keening sound. Then I did the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I threw the burning branch at my best friend. Jake's clothes caught fire immediately. The Wendigo screamed, a sound that was part rage, part agony, part something else entirely. As the flames spread, I could see something dark and shapeless trying to pour out of Jake's mouth, but the fire seemed to trap it, burning it away like smoke. Jake looked at me one last time with his own brown eyes. "Thank you," he said. Then the fire consumed him completely. I don't remember much about what happened next. I must have passed out from the shock and the injuries. When I woke up, it was daylight, and I was lying in a hospital bed in Boone. The search and rescue team found me 2 days later, hypothermic and delirious, babbling about monsters and possessed friends. They said I was lucky to be alive. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero that night, the coldest October night on record in North Carolina. They found Jake's body, or what was left of it, in the burned clearing. The official report said he'd died in an accidental fire, possibly started while trying to keep warm. I didn't correct them. I never told anyone the truth about what happened that night. Who would believe me? I barely believe it myself, and I lived through it. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear the Wendigo calling my name from somewhere deep in the mountains. And I wonder if killing Jake's body was enough to destroy it, or if it's still out there, waiting for the next group of hikers to wander too far off the marked trails. I don't go camping anymore, and I never will again. The nightmares started 3 weeks after I got out of the hospital. Always the same dream. I'm back in those mountains and Jake is walking toward me through the trees. But his eyes are black, and he's smiling that terrible smile, and he's saying he's hungry. So very, very hungry. I wake up screaming, covered in sweat, checking the locks on my doors and windows. Because in the dream, Jake tells me that the Wendigo isn't dead. It just needs time to grow strong again. And when it does, it's coming for me. After all, I still owe it a meal. The doctors say the dreams will fade with time, that trauma manifests in many ways, that what I experienced was severe psychological stress combined with hypothermia and altitude sickness. They give me pills to help me sleep, pills to help me forget. But the pills don't work. Because sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment at night, I smell it. That stench of rotting meat and old blood. And I know it's coming. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Black Mountains in North Carolina, near Mount Craig, where the ancient Pisgah National Forest stretches endlessly into shadow and mist. David Jones had been my best friend since college, and when he suggested we take a week-long backpacking trip through the most isolated section of the Black Mountains, I jumped at the chance. We'd been planning this trip for months, poring over topographical maps and researching trails that would take us far from the usual tourist routes. David was obsessed with finding places where few people had ever set foot, and I trusted his outdoor expertise completely. The drive up to the remote trailhead took us through increasingly desolate mountain roads. Cell towers became sparse, then non-existent. The GPS in David's truck started giving contradictory directions as we climbed higher into the mountains, the device's screen flickering between different route suggestions before finally going dark entirely. "Don't worry about it," David said, patting the detailed paper map spread across the dashboard. "These mountains have been here a lot longer than satellites. We'll navigate the old-fashioned way." I nodded, but something about the way the afternoon light filtered through the dense canopy of ancient hemlocks and Fraser firs made me uneasy. The shadows seemed too dark, too absolute, as if they were swallowing light rather than simply blocking it. We parked at the end of a barely maintained Forest Service road, where a weathered trail marker indicated the start of the Grandfather Trail, a path that would supposedly take us deep into the wilderness preserve. The marker was so old and faded that I could barely make out the words, and someone had scratched what looked like warning symbols into the wood below the official text. "What do you think those mean?" I asked, pointing to the scratches. David barely glanced at them. "Probably just kids messing around. Come on, we're burning daylight." We shouldered our packs and headed into the forest. The trail was well-defined at first, winding through stands of towering trees that had probably been growing since before the Civil War. But as we climbed higher, the path became increasingly overgrown and difficult to follow. Branches seemed to reach out and snag our packs, and more than once I had to stop and untangle myself from thorny vines that I swear hadn't been there moments before. The silence was the first thing that truly unnerved me. In most forests, there's a constant background symphony of birds, insects, and small animals moving through the underbrush. But here, the quiet was so complete it felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing all sound. "It's really quiet," I said to David as we paused to check our bearings. He looked up from his compass, frowning. "Yeah, I noticed that too. Could be a storm coming. Animals sometimes go silent before bad weather." But when I looked up through the canopy, the sky was clear and blue. No clouds, no wind, nothing to suggest approaching weather. We pressed on, and by late afternoon we'd reached what David claimed was our planned campsite, a small clearing beside a narrow creek that wound its way down from the higher peaks. The water was crystal clear but strangely warm, and when I knelt to fill our water bottles, I noticed that I couldn't see the bottom despite the clarity. The creek seemed to descend into an endless black depth. Setting up camp felt routine enough, though I noticed that David seemed increasingly agitated as the sun began to set. He kept checking and rechecking our gear, muttering under his breath about items not being where he'd left them. "What's wrong?" I asked as I watched him tear through his pack for the third time. "My knife," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I know I packed it in the side pocket, but it's not there. It's not anywhere." I helped him search, but the knife, an expensive tactical blade he'd owned for years, was nowhere to be found. We'd have to make do with my smaller pocket knife and the basic tools on our multi-tools. As darkness fell, we got our first real taste of how wrong things were going to get. The campfire simply would not stay lit. We'd built fires together dozens of times, and David was particularly skilled at it. But tonight, no matter what we tried, the flames would catch for a few minutes, then die back to smoldering embers. Even stranger, when the fire did briefly flare to life, The flames burned an odd green-blue color that cast everything in a sickly, unnatural light. "The wood must be damp," David said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. The deadfall we'd gathered was bone dry, and we'd used plenty of tinder. We eventually gave up and ate a cold dinner by the light of our headlamps. The darkness beyond our small circle of LED light felt alive somehow, pressing in on us with an almost physical presence. Every few minutes I thought I heard something moving in the forest around us. Not the normal sounds of small animals, but something larger, something that seemed to be pacing the perimeter of our camp. "Did you hear that?" I whispered during one particularly loud rustling in the bushes. David nodded, his hand moving instinctively to where his knife should have been. "Probably just a deer, or maybe a bear checking us out." But whatever was out there didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. The movements were too deliberate, too calculated. And there was something else, a smell that drifted to us on the still air, sweet and cloying, like rotting fruit mixed with something medicinal. We decided to sleep in shifts, taking turns keeping watch. I took the first shift, sitting with my back against a large boulder, trying to peer into the darkness beyond our campsite. The LED headlamp created a harsh circle of white light that only made the surrounding darkness seem more absolute. Around midnight, during my watch, I heard David make a sound from inside his sleeping bag, a low moan that didn't sound quite right. When I turned the light on him, his face was contorted in what looked like pain or fear, his eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids. "David," I whispered, but he didn't respond. I was about to shake him awake when he suddenly sat bolt upright, his eyes snapping open. But something was wrong with those eyes. They reflected the light from my headlamp like an animal's, showing silver in the darkness. "David?" I said again. He blinked several times, and when he looked at me again, his eyes were normal. "What? Did I miss my shift?" "No, you were having some kind of nightmare. You okay?" He rubbed his face with both hands. "Yeah, just weird dreams, really weird dreams." When it was his turn to keep watch, I curled up in my sleeping bag and tried to get some rest. But sleep was elusive. Every time I started to drift off, some sound would jolt me awake. A branch breaking, the soft whisper of something moving through the underbrush, or occasionally, what sounded almost like whispered voices just at the edge of hearing. The worst part was the feeling that we were being watched. Even with my eyes closed, I could sense something out there in the darkness, studying us with malevolent intelligence. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because I woke to the gray light of dawn filtering through the canopy. David was already up, crouched by the cold remains of our fire pit, staring at something in the ashes. "Michael," he called, his voice strange. "Come look at this." I crawled out of my sleeping bag and joined him by the fire pit. There, clearly visible in the gray ash, were footprints. But they weren't human prints, or even animal prints that I could recognize. They were elongated and narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the end of each toe. And they circled our entire campsite in a perfect ring. "What the hell made those?" I asked. David didn't answer immediately. He was studying the prints with an intensity that worried me. When he finally looked up, there was something different about his expression, a distance that hadn't been there the day before. "I don't know," he said, "but whatever it was here all night." We broke camp quickly, both of us eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever had visited us in the darkness. But as we packed our gear, I noticed more things going wrong. My water bottles, which I'd filled the night before, were now empty. Not leaked out, but somehow drained completely. Several items from my pack were missing entirely, including my backup flashlight and first aid kit. David seemed increasingly agitated as we prepared to leave. He kept checking his map and compass, muttering about inconsistencies that didn't make sense. "The trail should head northwest from here," he said, pointing to our location on the map. "But the compass is showing magnetic north as... This can't be right." I looked over his shoulder at the compass. The needle was spinning slowly in a complete circle, never settling on any particular direction. Maybe it's damaged, I suggested. It was working fine yesterday. David shook the compass, then held it up to the light. This is a good compass. Military grade. It doesn't just break. Despite the equipment malfunctions, we decided to continue deeper into the wilderness. David claimed he could navigate by landmarks and the position of the sun, and I trusted his experience. But as the morning wore on, I began to suspect we were walking in circles. The trees all looked the same, massive, ancient things that blocked most of the sky. The undergrowth was so thick in places that we had to push through walls of tangled vines and thorns. And always, there was that oppressive silence. By midday, we'd reached another clearing, this one larger than our previous campsite. A small cabin sat at the far edge of the clearing, so old and weathered it looked like it might collapse at any moment. Half the roof had caved in, and the walls were covered in some kind of dark growth that looked more like fungus than moss. "Thank God," David said, dropping his pack. "Shelter. We can rest here and figure out where we are." But I didn't want to go anywhere near that cabin. Just looking at it made my skin crawl. There was something fundamentally wrong about the structure, something that went beyond mere decay. "I don't think we should go in there," I said. David was already walking toward the cabin. "Come on, don't be paranoid. It's just an old hunting cabin, probably been abandoned for decades." Against my better judgment, I followed him to the entrance. The door was missing, leaving only a black rectangle that seemed to swallow light. The smell hit us before we got within 10 feet of the threshold. That same sweet, cloying odor we'd noticed the night before, but much stronger now. David stepped inside first, and I heard him gasp. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. When I joined him in the doorway, I saw what had shocked him. The interior walls of the cabin were covered in scratches, thousands of them carved deep into the wood. They formed patterns that hurt to look at, symbols that seemed to twist and writhe in my peripheral vision. And scattered across the floor were bones. Lots of bones. "We need to leave," I said, backing away from the doorway. "Right now." But David was moving deeper into the cabin, seemingly fascinated by the scratches on the walls. "Look at this," he said, running his fingers along one of the carved symbols. "It's like some kind of language." "David, come on, we're leaving." He didn't respond. He was completely absorbed in studying the wall carvings, tracing the symbols with his fingertips as if he could read them. "David!" When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes had that same reflective quality I'd noticed during his nightmare, and when he smiled, it was with too many teeth. "Just give me a minute," he said, but his voice sounded different, deeper, rougher. I grabbed his arm and physically pulled him away from the wall. "We're leaving now." For a moment, he resisted, his muscles tensing as if he might fight me. Then suddenly he relaxed, blinking rapidly like someone waking from a trance. "What?" "Yeah, okay. You're right. This place is creepy." We left the clearing quickly, but I noticed David kept looking back over his shoulder at the cabin, and for the rest of the afternoon, he was different, more withdrawn. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, and I caught him staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. As evening approached, we made camp in another small clearing. This time, I insisted on gathering all the firewood myself while David set up our shelter. I needed some time alone to think, and I wanted to keep him away from any more strange influences. The forest felt even more oppressive as the sun began to set. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. And as I gathered deadfall from the forest floor, I had the constant sensation of being watched. When I returned to camp with an armload of wood, David was sitting motionless by our packs, staring into the gathering darkness. "Everything okay?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you hear that?" I stopped and listened. At first, there was only the usual oppressive silence. But then, faintly, I did hear something. Voices. Multiple voices, speaking in unison, but so distant and muffled that I couldn't make out any words. "What is that?" I asked. David stood up slowly, his head tilted as if straining to hear. "They're calling," he said. "Calling what?" "Me." The way he said it made my blood run cold. There was a longing in his voice, an eagerness that was completely unlike the David I knew. "We should build a fire," I said, trying to inject some normalcy into the situation. "Get some light going." But when I tried to light the kindling, the same thing happened as the night before. The fire would catch briefly, burn with that unnatural blue-green flame, then die back to smoldering embers. As full darkness fell, the whispering voices grew louder. Not loud enough to understand, but definitely closer. And David was becoming increasingly agitated, pacing the perimeter of our campsite like a caged animal. "I need to check something," he said suddenly. "Check what?" I'll be right back." He started walking toward the tree line and I grabbed his arm. "Don't. Whatever's out there, we face it together or not at all." David looked at me, and in the dim light of our failing fire, his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire visible eye, as if it had been filled with ink. "Let go of me," he said, and his voice was no longer entirely human. I released his arm and stepped back, my hand moving instinctively to my pocket knife. David smiled that too wide smile and walked into the darkness beyond our camp. I sat by the dying fire for what felt like hours, straining to hear any sound that might indicate what had happened to my friend. The whispering voices continued, sometimes seeming to come from different directions, sometimes sounding like they were right behind me. Eventually, I heard footsteps approaching the camp. Slow, deliberate footsteps that I recognized as David's gait. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by apprehension when I realized how long he'd been gone. "David," I called. He stepped into the circle of dim light cast by our smoldering fire, and I knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. He moved differently, too smoothly, like he was gliding rather than walking, and his face was completely expressionless, blank in a way that was deeply unsettling. "I found them," he said, but his voice was flat, emotionless. "Found what?" "The others." He sat down across the fire from me, never breaking eye contact. In the flickering light, his pupils were enormous, and I couldn't see any of the usual warmth or personality that had made David who he was. "What others?" I asked. "The ones who came before us? The ones who are waiting?" Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but where could I go? I was lost in the middle of a vast wilderness with no working GPS, no compass, and no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization. "David, you're scaring me," I said. He tilted his head, studying me like I was some kind of interesting specimen. "Am I?" The way he said it, like he was genuinely curious rather than concerned, chilled me to the bone. "Yeah, you are. You've been acting strange since we found that cabin." "Have I?" Again, that detached curiosity. "I feel different, clearer, like I can see things I couldn't see before." "What kind of things?" David's smile was predatory. "I can see how hungry they are, how long they've been waiting for fresh meat." That was when I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was sitting across the fire from me, it wasn't David anymore. Not entirely. I started to reach for my pocket knife, moving slowly and carefully. But David, or the thing wearing David's face, was faster than any human had a right to be. In one fluid motion, he lunged across the dying fire and pinned me to the ground. His hands around my throat were ice cold, and his strength was inhuman. I struggled, but it was like fighting a marble statue. He didn't even seem to be exerting effort. "Don't fight," he said, his voice now carrying harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "It will be easier if you don't fight." I managed to get my hand to my pocket and pull out my knife. With desperate strength, I drove the blade into David's shoulder. He didn't even flinch. Black blood oozed from the wound, but he showed no sign of pain. Instead, he seemed amused. "That won't work," he said. "I'm not really here anymore." But the distraction was enough for me to break free of his grip and roll away. I scrambled to my feet and ran into the forest, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. Behind me, I heard laughter. Not David's laugh, but something that sounded like multiple voices laughing in perfect, horrible unison. I ran blindly through the darkness, branches tearing at my clothes and face, roots catching my feet and sending me stumbling. The forest seemed to be actively working against me, paths appearing and disappearing, solid ground giving way to hidden hollows that sent me tumbling. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I crouched behind a massive fallen tree, trying to control my breathing while I listened for sounds of pursuit. The forest was silent again, but it was a malevolent silence, like a predator holding its breath. That's when I heard David's voice calling my name. "Michael! Michael, where are you? I need help." The voice was coming from somewhere to my left, and it sounded exactly like the old David. Frightened, confused, human. For a moment, I almost believed that whatever had possessed him had let go, that my friend had somehow fought his way back to the surface. "Michael, please, something's wrong with me. I can't remember. I need help." Every fiber of my being wanted to respond, to go to my friend's aid, but I forced myself to stay hidden. Because underneath the fear and confusion in David's voice, I could hear something else. Amusement. Like whatever was controlling him was enjoying this game of cat and mouse. The calling continued for what felt like hours. David's voice moving through the forest around me, sometimes close enough that I was sure I would be discovered, sometimes distant enough that I wondered if I was imagining it. "Michael, I found the way out. Follow my voice." "Michael, I'm hurt. I think my leg is broken." "Michael, there are things out here. Horrible things. We need to stick together." Each plea was perfectly crafted to exploit my loyalty and friendship, but the underlying wrongness was always there. The voice was just slightly off, too perfect, like a recording of David rather than David himself. As dawn began to break, the calling stopped. The forest returned to its oppressive silence, and I was left alone with my terror and the growing realization that I was completely lost. I spent the day moving carefully through the wilderness, trying to find some landmark that might guide me back toward civilization. But every direction looked the same. Endless trees, impenetrable undergrowth, and that constant sense of being watched. By afternoon, I was becoming dangerously dehydrated. I'd lost my pack during my flight from the campsite, which meant no water, no food, and no survival gear. I found a small stream and drank from it, even though the water had the same unnaturally warm temperature as the creek near our first campsite. As I knelt by the stream, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Reflected in the water, standing directly behind me, was David. But when I spun around, nothing was there. I looked back at the water and the reflection was gone too. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I found a defensible position with my back against a large boulder and my knife in my hand, and I waited for whatever was going to happen. The attack came just after midnight. I heard them before I saw them. Footsteps approaching from multiple directions, moving with that same unnaturally smooth gait I'd noticed in David. When they stepped into the moonlight, I saw that there were 3 of them. David was in the center, flanked by 2 other figures that I didn't recognize. The other 2 looked like hikers, a middle-aged woman and a younger man, but they had the same black eyes and predatory stillness that David had shown. "Hello, Michael," David said, his voice carrying those impossible harmonics. "We've been looking for you." "What do you want?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to know the answer. "We want you to join us," the woman said. "It's better this way. No more fear, no more pain. Just purpose." They began to circle me, moving with the coordinated precision of pack hunters. I realized that running was pointless. They'd just hunt me down again. My only chance was to fight. When David lunged at me, I was ready. I drove my knife toward his chest, but he moved aside with inhuman speed. The blade caught him in the side, and again that black blood oozed from the wound. But this time, he showed a reaction. Not pain exactly, but surprise. And for just a moment his eyes flickered back to their normal brown color. "Michael?" The voice was David's. Really, David's. "What's happening to me? I can't control." Then the black eyes returned and he smiled that terrible smile. "Your friend is still in here," he said. "He can see everything we're doing. He just can't stop it." The psychological torture of that revelation was almost worse than the physical threat. To know that the real David was trapped somewhere inside that thing, forced to watch as his body was used for evil. The three creatures attacked in unison. I managed to dodge the woman, but the younger man caught me in the ribs with a blow that sent me flying. I hit the ground hard, the knife spinning away into the darkness. They stood over me, and I thought it was over. But then something extraordinary happened. David, the real David, fought back. His body suddenly convulsed and he screamed. Not the harmonized voice of the thing possessing him, but a purely human scream of rage and revulsion. He grabbed the woman beside him and, with strength I didn't know he possessed, threw her against a tree. The impact was so violent that I heard bones crack. "Run!" David shouted, his voice normal again. "I can't hold it back for long." I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet and ran, leaving David locked in battle with whatever was inside him. Behind me, I heard sounds that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Inhuman screams, the sound of trees being torn apart, and through it all, David's voice shouting my name, sometimes in warning, sometimes in the terrible harmony of the possessed. I ran through the forest for hours, guided only by moonlight and desperate fear. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Eventually, impossibly, I saw lights ahead, real lights, the warm yellow glow of electric bulbs. I crashed through the tree line and found myself on a paved road, where a county sheriff's deputy was just getting out of his patrol car. "Jesus, son, what happened to you?" he asked, taking in my torn clothes and blood-covered face. I tried to explain, but the words came out as incoherent babbling. The deputy, his name tag read Williams, called for backup and an ambulance, then wrapped me in a blanket and gave me water. "My friend," I managed to say. "David Jones. He's still out there." "Okay, we'll find him," Deputy Williams said. "Can you tell me where you last saw him?" But when I tried to describe the location, I realized I had no idea where I'd been. The forest had seemed to shift and change around me, and none of the landmarks I remembered matched anything on the deputy's detailed topographical maps. The search for David lasted 3 weeks and involved dozens of volunteers, bloodhounds, and even helicopter searches. They found our truck at the trailhead, exactly where we'd left it. They found traces of our first campsite, but they never found David, or the cabin with the carved symbols, or any evidence of the creatures I'd encountered. The official report listed David as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or wildlife attack. A tragic but not uncommon occurrence in the vast wilderness of the North Carolina mountains. I tried to tell them the truth, but nobody believed me. The trauma counselor said I was suffering from survivor's guilt and exposure-induced hallucinations. The rational part of my mind wanted to accept that explanation, but I knew what I'd experienced was real. 3 months later, I received a package in the mail. No return address, postmarked from a small town near the Black Mountains. Inside was David's tactical knife, the one that had gone missing from our first campsite. The blade was clean, but carved into the handle was a symbol I recognized from the cabin walls, and tucked into the packaging was a note, written in David's handwriting. "Still waiting, still hungry, come back soon." I've never returned to North Carolina. I've moved 3 times since then, always to cities far from any significant wilderness, but sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers just at the edge of hearing, voices calling my name with that terrible harmony. And sometimes, when I look in mirrors or windows after dark, I see David standing behind me. He's always smiling, that too wide smile, his eyes black as midnight. He's still waiting. They're all still waiting. And I know that someday, despite all my precautions, they're going to find me. The worst part is that I'm starting to want them to. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the fall of 2024, deep in the Pisgah National Forest of North Carolina, near a place the locals call Harmon's Den, a name that should have been our first warning. The four of us worked together at a marketing firm in Charlotte, and the camping trip was Jennifer's idea. "We need to decompress," she'd said after another brutal quarter of impossible deadlines and demanding clients. Jennifer Davis was our team lead, the kind of person who could talk anyone into anything with her infectious enthusiasm and those bright green eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She'd planned everything down to the last detail: the permits, the trail maps, even our meal schedule. Robert Johnson had been reluctant at first. At 28, he was the youngest of our group and had a nervous energy that made him seem like he was always looking over his shoulder. "I don't know, Mike," he'd said to me privately. "Something about being that far from civilization makes me nervous." But Jennifer had worn him down with promises of incredible hiking trails and the clearest night skies he'd ever seen. Ashley Walker, our graphic designer, had jumped at the chance immediately. She was always posting Instagram photos of her weekend adventures: rock climbing, kayaking, mountain biking. At 30, she was fearless in a way that sometimes worried the rest of us. "Finally, something actually exciting," she'd laughed when Jennifer first pitched the idea. "I should have listened to Robert's instincts." We drove up on a Thursday morning in early October, the mountains already showing their autumn colors. The last real town we passed through was Marshall, and after that, civilization became increasingly sparse. Gas stations gave way to roadside fruit stands, which gave way to hand-painted signs advertising fresh honey and mountain crafts, which eventually gave way to nothing but trees and the occasional cluster of weathered mailboxes marking dirt roads that disappeared into the forest. The GPS started acting up about 20 miles from our planned trailhead. The screen would flicker, showing our location jumping erratically across the map. "Probably the mountains interfering with the signal," Ashley said from the passenger seat, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty that was unusual for her. When we finally found the trailhead, a barely marked pull-off next to a rusted Forest Service sign, we were already 2 hours behind schedule. The parking area was empty except for a single pickup truck that looked like it had been sitting there for weeks. Rust ate at its wheel wells, and the back window was spiderwebbed with cracks. "Cheerful," Robert muttered, shouldering his pack. He'd barely spoken during the last hour of the drive, just stared out the window at the dense forest that pressed close to the narrow mountain road. The trail started innocuously enough. It was well marked for the first mile, winding through stands of oak and maple that filtered the afternoon sun into dancing patterns on the forest floor. But as we climbed higher, the blazes became fewer and farther between. The path narrowed, sometimes disappearing entirely into tangles of rhododendron and mountain laurel that we had to push through, the thick branches clawing at our packs and clothes. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Robert asked for the third time in 20 minutes. Jennifer consulted her map, frowning. "The trail should be more defined than this." She looked around at the dense undergrowth surrounding us. Maybe we missed a turn. But we hadn't missed anything. I was sure of it. I'd been watching the blazes carefully, and we'd followed them exactly. It was as if the trail itself was changing, becoming wilder and more overgrown with each step we took. The trees grew thicker as we climbed, their canopy blocking out more and more of the sky until we were walking in a green twilight even though it was only mid-afternoon. The sounds of the forest seemed muffled and wrong, too quiet in some places, too loud in others. Birds would suddenly stop singing all at once, leaving us in an oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of our footsteps on dead leaves. We'd planned to reach our campsite by 4 o'clock, but by the time we found anything resembling a suitable spot, the sun was already sinking behind the ridgeline. The clearing we chose was maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by towering hemlocks whose drooping branches created walls of shadow. A small stream gurgled nearby, which should have been comforting, but the sound seemed to echo strangely, as if the water was running through a tunnel rather than over rocks. "This'll have to do," Jennifer said, though she didn't sound happy about it. She kept glancing around the clearing with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, uncertainty mixed with something that might have been fear. Setting up camp took longer than it should have. Robert's tent poles wouldn't fit together properly. They'd worked fine when we'd practiced in Jennifer's backyard the week before, but now they seemed to be slightly different sizes. Ashley's sleeping bag was damp despite being stored in a supposedly waterproof stuff sack, and my camp stove refused to light, even though I'd checked the fuel canister that morning. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, clicking the igniter for the 10th time. The spark was bright and clear, but the burner wouldn't catch. "Here, let me try," Ashley said, but she had no better luck. The fuel was flowing. I could smell it, but something was preventing it from igniting. In the end, we had to build a fire the old-fashioned way, with Robert's emergency matches and some dry tinder Jennifer found under one of the hemlocks. Even that took 3 tries, the flames guttering out twice for no apparent reason before finally catching and spreading to the kindling. As darkness fell, the forest around us came alive with sounds that weren't quite right. Branches creaked and groaned in ways that suggested movement, but there was no wind. Something large crashed through the underbrush maybe 50 yards away, but when we called out, there was no response, and underneath it all was a constant rustling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Probably just squirrels," Jennifer said, but her voice was tight. She'd given up pretending to read her book and was staring into the fire with an intensity that made me nervous. Robert had positioned himself so he could see into the trees behind us. "That didn't sound like squirrels," he said quietly. "That sounded bigger, much bigger." We all heard it then, a low, rumbling sound that was part growl, part moan. It seemed to circle our campsite, staying just beyond the reach of our firelight. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt something primal and ancient stir in my chest. This was the fear our ancestors had known, huddled around their own fires while things with teeth and claws prowled the darkness beyond. "Should we?" Ashley started to say, then stopped. "Should we what? Pack up and leave in the dark? Try to find our way back down a barely marked trail with only flashlights to guide us?" The rational part of my brain knew that was a terrible idea, but the animal part was screaming at me to run. "We stick together," Jennifer said firmly, "and we keep the fire going." But keeping the fire going proved to be harder than expected. Despite adding fresh wood regularly, the flames kept dying down to barely glowing embers. Twice I had to rebuild it completely, and each time it seemed to take longer to catch. By midnight, I was feeding it almost constantly, and even then it never seemed to get truly hot. The flames danced and flickered in colors that weren't quite right. Too blue, too green, occasionally flashing silver in a way that made my eyes water. We took turns staying awake to tend the fire, but none of us really slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something that jerked me back to alertness. Footsteps circling our camp, branches snapping under heavy weight, or worst of all, what sounded like whispered conversations in a language I didn't recognize. During Ashley's watch, sometime around 3 in the morning, she woke us all with a sharp intake of breath. "There's someone out there," she whispered, pointing toward the tree line. I followed her gaze and saw it, a pale shape moving between the trunks, too tall and thin to be entirely human. It seemed to flow rather than walk, and when it turned in our direction, I caught a glimpse of eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Hello?" Jennifer called out, her voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The shape paused, then melted back into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. What the hell was that? Robert's voice was barely a whisper. None of us had an answer. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first gray light finally began to filter through the trees, we were all haggard and exhausted, but the forest around us looked ordinary again, almost innocent. The oppressive atmosphere of the night faded like a bad dream, and we began to convince ourselves that we'd let our imaginations run wild. "Probably just a deer," Ashley said, though she didn't sound convinced. "The shadows and firelight can play tricks on you." We made a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee. My stove worked fine in the daylight and broke camp. The plan was to hike to a scenic overlook about 3 miles away, then loop back to the car. A nice, easy day hike to work out the kinks from our restless night. But the trail that had been difficult to follow the day before seemed to have vanished entirely. Where there should have been blazes marking the path, we found only unmarked trees. The GPS on Jennifer's phone spun uselessly, unable to get a signal under the thick canopy. "This is impossible," she said, staring at her device. "We're not even showing up on the map anymore." I pulled out my own phone and got the same result. No signal, no GPS lock, and the map app showing nothing but a blank green space where we should have been. "Maybe we should head back to the car," Robert suggested. "This doesn't feel right." But when we tried to retrace our steps, the way back seemed as unmarked as the way forward. The clearing where we'd camped was nowhere to be found, even though we'd been walking for less than an hour. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself during the night, shifting paths and landmarks like pieces on a chessboard. "This is crazy," Ashley said, but her usual confidence was gone. She kept looking over her shoulder, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she adjusted her pack straps. We picked a direction that felt right and started walking, hoping to hit either the trail or the road eventually. But as the morning wore on, the forest grew stranger. Trees that should have been straight grew in impossible spirals. Rocks balanced in configurations that seemed to defy gravity. And everywhere there were signs of something large moving through the underbrush. Broken branches, deep gouges in tree bark, and footprints that were almost human but not quite. It was Robert who found the bones. We'd stopped for water and a snack around noon in a small clearing beside a stream that ran red with iron oxide. Robert had wandered a few yards away to investigate what he thought was an interesting rock formation, and his sharp intake of breath brought us all running. The bones were scattered in a rough circle, some still connected by dried tendons and scraps of leathery skin. They'd been there for months, maybe longer, bleached white by sun and weather, but what made us all back away in horror was their arrangement. They'd been placed deliberately, almost ceremonially, with the skull positioned at the center like an altar. "Jesus Christ," Ashley whispered. "Is that human?" Jennifer said, her voice barely audible. "That's a human skull." The bones were wrong in other ways, too. Some were twisted and warped as if they'd been subjected to incredible pressure. Others showed deep scratches and gouges that could only have been made by claws or very large teeth. And scattered among them were smaller bones, fingers and toes, that had been cracked open, the marrow long since consumed. "We need to get out of here," Robert said, backing away from the circle. "Now." But as we turned to leave, we realized we were no longer alone. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible between the trees, was a figure that might once have been human. It was impossibly tall and thin, with skin that hung in loose folds and eyes that were completely black. When it smiled, I saw teeth like broken glass. None of us moved. None of us even breathed. We just stood there, paralyzed by a terror so complete it seemed to shut down our ability to think or act. The thing watched us for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, its head tilted at an angle that would have broken a normal person's neck. Then it was gone, vanishing between one blink and the next. "Run," Jennifer whispered. We ran. I don't know how long we crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and faces, roots trying to trip us with every step. The sounds of our panicked flight seemed to echo through the forest, drawing responses from things we couldn't see. howls, and shrieks that came from no animal I'd ever heard. When we finally stopped, gasping and exhausted, we found ourselves in another clearing. This one was different from the bone circle, larger, with a ring of standing stones that had definitely not been there in any of our research about the area. The stones were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, carved deep into the rock with a precision that suggested tools rather than natural weathering. "What is this place?" Ashley asked, but none of us had an answer. Robert was studying the symbols, his face pale. "These look old," he said. Really old. Pre-Columbian, maybe." "We shouldn't be here," Jennifer said. She was turning in slow circles, taking in the stone circle and the too quiet forest around us. "This place, it feels wrong." She was right. There was something fundamentally disturbing about the clearing, something that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. The air tasted metallic, like blood and copper. And underneath the silence was a sound I felt more than heard, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Look," Ashley said, pointing to the center of the circle. There, where the thrumming was strongest, was a depression in the ground. It was perfectly circular and maybe 10 feet across, filled with what looked like dark water but didn't reflect the sky. As I watched, something moved beneath the surface, a pale shape that might have been a hand, reaching up from impossible depths. "We're leaving," I said. "Right now." But as we turned to go, Robert stopped. "Wait," he said. "Do you hear that?" I listened, and underneath the thrumming, I heard something else. Voices, calling our names. They seemed to come from the dark pool in the center of the circle, echoing up from whatever depths lay beneath that black water. "Michael," they called. Jennifer, Ashley, Robert. The voices were familiar but wrong, like recordings played at the wrong speed. They promised things: safety, warmth, answers to questions we didn't know we had. All we had to do was come closer, just a little closer. "Don't listen," Jennifer said, grabbing Robert's arm as he took a step toward the pool. "Whatever that is, don't listen to it." But it was hard not to listen. The voices were seductive in a way that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to something primitive in our brains. They knew exactly what each of us wanted to hear, exactly what fears and desires would draw us forward. Robert shook his head, as if waking from a dream. "What was I—" He looked at the pool, then back at us, his face confused and frightened. "For a second there, I thought I heard my mother calling me." "Your mother's been dead for 5 years," Ashley said gently. "I know," Robert whispered. But it sounded just like her. We backed away from the circle slowly, none of us willing to turn our backs on that dark pool. The voices continued to call, growing more insistent, more desperate. They promised secrets and power and reunion with lost loves. They promised an end to pain and fear and loneliness. They promised everything except the truth. When we finally made it back into the trees, the voices faded but didn't disappear entirely. I could still hear them at the edge of my consciousness, whispering suggestions and half-formed thoughts that weren't my own. The rest of the day passed in a blur of wrong turns and false paths. Every direction we tried seemed to lead us deeper into the forest rather than out of it. The trees grew thicker and stranger, their bark scarred with symbols that matched the ones on the standing stones. Animals watched us from the shadows: deer with too many eyes, birds with human faces, things that scuttled between the roots and might once have been squirrels but were something else now. As evening approached, we found ourselves back where we started, or at least a clearing that looked very much like our original campsite. The same circle of hemlocks, the same gurgling stream, even the same flat spot where we'd pitched our tents. But our gear was gone, and in its place was a collection of items that belonged to other campers, other travelers who had found their way to this place and never left. There were tents in various states of decay, some so old that they fell apart at a touch, sleeping bags that had been shredded by claws, backpacks with contents scattered across the forest floor, water bottles and camp stoves and trail mix packages that mice had gotten into years ago. And bones. So many bones. "How many people have been here?" Ashley whispered, picking up a faded driver's license. The photo showed a young man with a bright smile, but the issue date was from 1987. "Too many," Jennifer said. She was standing over a collection of items that included children's toys, a small stuffed bear with one eye missing, a set of building blocks, a tiny hiking boot that couldn't have belonged to anyone older than 5. I found my own pack among the debris, or what was left of it. The fabric had been shredded, and something had eaten through the metal frame. My sleeping bag was there too, but it was wrong somehow, longer than it should have been, and when I unzipped it, the inside was stained with something dark and sticky that definitely wasn't mine. "We need to get a fire going," Robert said. He was gathering sticks with mechanical precision, but his hands were shaking. "It'll be dark soon." The fire was even harder to light than the night before. The matches kept going out, even when there was no wind. The kindling seemed damp despite having been stored in a dry place, and when we finally got flames, they cast shadows that moved independently of the objects that should have created them. As darkness fell, the sounds started again. But this time they weren't random forest noises. This time they were organized, purposeful. Things were moving in the trees around our clearing, staying just outside the reach of our firelight, but definitely there. I could see eyes reflecting the flames. Too many eyes, at heights that didn't make sense for any normal animal. "They're watching us," Ashley said quietly. She'd positioned herself so she could see most of the tree line, and her voice was steady despite the terror that had to be coursing through her veins. "What do they want?" Robert asked. "Us," Jennifer said simply. The voices started again around midnight, but this time they came from multiple directions. They spoke in languages that predated human civilization, in frequencies that made our teeth ache and our bones vibrate. And underneath the alien sounds were words we could understand, our names spoken in the voices of people we'd lost. "Michael," my father called from the darkness. He'd been dead for 10 years, but his voice was exactly as I remembered it. "Come here, son. I've missed you so much." "Don't listen," Jennifer said, but her own resolve was wavering. Tears were streaming down her face as she stared into the forest. "Mom?" she whispered. "Is that really you?" Robert was the first to break. He stood up suddenly, his eyes fixed on something none of the rest of us could see. "Sarah," he breathed, "you came back." Sarah had been his girlfriend in college. She'd died in a car accident 2 weeks before graduation, and Robert had never really gotten over it. He told me once that he still set a place for her at dinner sometimes, still found himself reaching for his phone to call her when something good happened. "She's calling for me," he said, taking a step toward the tree line. "She needs my help." "Robert, no," I said, grabbing his arm. "That's not Sarah. Sarah is dead." But he shook me off with surprising strength. "You don't understand," he said. "She's trapped out there. She's been waiting for me all these years, and now I can finally save her." "Robert, please," Ashley said. "You know this isn't real." But logic couldn't compete with the voices. They knew exactly which strings to pull, exactly which memories to invoke. They spoke of love and loss and regret, of chances missed and words left unsaid. They offered forgiveness and reunion and all the things we'd given up hope of ever having. Robert took another step toward the darkness, and this time none of us could stop him. He walked into the trees as if in a trance, following a voice that promised everything his broken heart had ever wanted. "Robert," Jennifer called after him, "come back." But he was already gone, swallowed by the forest as completely as if he'd never existed. We waited for him to return, keeping the fire burning and calling his name until our voices were hoarse. But as the hours passed, it became clear that he wasn't coming back. Not as himself, anyway. Dawn brought no relief. If anything, the forest seemed more oppressive in the gray morning light, The shadows were deeper, the silence more complete, and there were signs that something large had been moving around our campsite during the night. Footprints in the soft earth that were almost human but too long, too narrow, with claw marks where toes should have been. "We have to find him," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Jennifer," I said gently, "you know we can't. Whatever took him, whatever he went to find, it's not something we can fight." Ashley was studying the footprints, her face pale. "These are fresh," she said, "and they circle the clearing. Whatever was out there last night, it was studying us." As if summoned by her words, Robert emerged from the tree line. At first glance, he looked normal. Same clothes, same general build, same face. But something was fundamentally wrong with the way he moved. His gait was too smooth, too fluid, like he was floating just above the ground rather than walking on it. And his eyes were different. Not the color, but the way they reflected light, like an animal's. "Hey guys," he said, his voice exactly as it should have been. "Sorry I wandered off last night. I got turned around in the dark." "Robert," Jennifer said carefully, "where did you go?" He smiled, but the expression didn't reach those strange, reflective eyes. "Just checking out the area. There are some really interesting formations deeper in the forest. You should come see them." "Are you okay?" Ashley asked. "You look different." "I feel great," Robert said. "Better than I have in years, actually, like a weight's been lifted off my shoulders." But as he spoke, I noticed things that made my skin crawl. He wasn't blinking often enough. His breathing seemed wrong, too shallow, or maybe not at all. And when he smiled, I caught a glimpse of teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "Robert," I said slowly, "what did you find out there?" His smile widened, and this time I was sure about the teeth. They were like a shark's, rows and rows of triangular points designed for tearing flesh. "I found the truth," he said, "about this place, about what we're really doing here." "What truth?" Jennifer asked, though I could tell she was starting to back away from him. "We're not here by accident," Robert said. "We were called, chosen. This place has been waiting for us for a very long time." The thing that looked like Robert took a step closer, and I saw that its feet weren't quite touching the ground. It was hovering maybe an inch above the forest floor, supported by something that definitely wasn't muscle and bone. "You're not Robert," Ashley said quietly. "Of course I am," it replied, but the voice was starting to change. Still recognizably Robert's, but with harmonic overtones that made my ears ache. "I'm just improved, enhanced, made into something better than human." "What happened to him?" Jennifer demanded. "What did you do to our friend?" The Robert thing's smile became impossibly wide, stretching far beyond what human facial muscles should have allowed. "He's still here," it said, and for a moment the voice was purely Robert's, full of pain and terror. "Help me," it whispered. "Please, I can't control." Then the other voice took over again, alien and cold. "He's learning to appreciate his new perspective. Soon he'll understand that human concerns are so limiting, so small." I realized we were in immediate danger. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just wearing Robert's appearance like a mask. It had somehow merged with him, taken him over from the inside. And now it was studying us with the patient hunger of a predator deciding which prey to take first. "Run," I whispered to Jennifer and Ashley. "But Robert," Jennifer started. "That's not Robert anymore," I said. "Run!" The thing that had been our friend let out a sound that was part laugh, part howl. It rose into the air, arms spread wide, and I saw that its fingers had stretched into claws and its mouth had opened to reveal row after row of needle-sharp teeth. We ran. Behind us, the Robert thing gave chase, but it didn't run the way a human would. It flowed through the air above the treetops, sometimes visible as a dark shape against the sky, sometimes invisible until its laughter echoed from directly overhead. It was toying with us, I realized. It could have caught us at any time, but it was enjoying the hunt. The forest seemed to be working against us. Branches reached out to snag our clothes and scratch our faces. Roots rose up to trip us. The ground itself seemed to shift under our feet, turning solid earth into treacherous bogs that sucked at our boots and slowed our progress. Ashley was the first to fall. A root caught her ankle and sent her sprawling, and when she tried to get up, her leg collapsed under her. I heard the bone snap from 10 feet away. "My ankle," she gasped. "I think it's broken." Jennifer and I helped her to her feet, but it was clear she couldn't put any weight on the injured leg. We were going to have to carry her, and that would slow us down to the point where the Robert thing could take its time deciding how to kill us. "Leave me," Ashley said through gritted teeth. "I'll just slow you down." "Like hell," I said, getting her arm around my shoulders. "We all get out of here together, or we don't get out at all." But as we struggled through the underbrush, Ashley growing heavier with each step, I heard the Robert thing getting closer. Its laughter was right above us now, and I could smell something rotten and sweet, like flowers left too long in the sun. "Michael," it called in Robert's voice. "Jennifer. Ashley. Why are you running from me? I'm still your friend. I just want to show you what I've learned." We found ourselves back at the bone circle, though I was sure we'd been heading in the opposite direction. The standing stones seemed taller now, their carved symbols glowing with a faint phosphorescence that made my eyes water to look at directly. "This is where it wants us," Jennifer said. "This is where it's been hurting us all along." The dark pool in the center of the circle was bubbling now, releasing gases that smelled like sulfur and decay. Things moved beneath its surface, pale shapes that might have been hands or faces or tentacles. And rising from its depths was a sound like singing, if singing could be made of screams and despair. The Robert thing descended from the sky to hover above the pool, its borrowed face twisted into an expression of ecstasy. "Isn't it beautiful?" it said. "Can you hear them calling? All the others who came before, all the ones who joined the family. They're so happy here, so complete." "What are you?" I demanded. "I am what remains when humanity is stripped away," it replied. "I am hunger given form, need made manifest, and I have been so very hungry for so very long." Around the edges of the clearing, other shapes began to emerge from the forest. People, or things that had once been people. Some were recent additions, hikers and campers who had vanished over the past few years, their faces still recognizable despite the changes that had been made to them. Others were older, their clothes rotted away and their skin stretched tight over bones that had been reshaped into new and terrible configurations. But all of them had the same eyes, black and empty and infinitely hungry. "So many friends to meet," the Robert thing said. "So many stories to share. You'll love it here once you let go of your human attachments, once you stop fighting what you're meant to become." Ashley was unconscious now, her body limp against my side. The pain from her broken ankle had been too much, and she'd passed out somewhere between the forest and the stone circle. Part of me envied her, at least she wouldn't have to see what was coming. "What do you want from us?" Jennifer asked. "Everything," the Robert thing replied. "Your memories, your fears, your loves and hates and dreams. All the things that make you human. I want to taste them, to understand them, to make them part of myself. And then you join us. You become part of the family, part of something so much larger and more beautiful than your small human lives could ever be." The other creatures were closing in now, forming a circle around us. I recognized some of them from missing person reports I'd seen over the years. Hikers who had vanished without a trace, campers whose abandoned tents had been found empty and undisturbed. They moved with the same fluid grace as the Robert thing, their feet not quite touching the ground. "Don't fight it," the Robert thing said, its voice taking on multiple harmonics that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to my brain. "Fighting only makes it hurt more. Let go. Let me in. Let me show you what you could become." But as it spoke, I noticed something. For just a moment, the creature's concentration slipped, and I heard Robert's real voice underneath the alien tones. "Kill me," he whispered, Please, Michael, don't let it keep me like this." The Robert thing's head snapped toward me, its black eyes narrowing. "He's gone," it said. "What you heard was just an echo, a memory playing back. Robert chose this. He wanted to be part of something greater." But I'd heard the pain in his voice, the desperate plea for release. Whatever this thing was, it hadn't completely absorbed him yet. Some part of my friend was still trapped inside, still fighting. I looked around the circle of creatures trying to find a way out. The standing stones were at my back, the dark pool to my left, and hungry monsters in every other direction. Ashley was dead weight in my arms, and Jennifer was barely holding herself together. But then I remembered something Robert had said earlier, back when he was still himself. Something about the symbols on the stones looking pre-Columbian, ancient protections, maybe, or warnings. The creatures were getting closer, their empty eyes fixed on us with anticipation. The Robert thing was speaking again, its voice washing over us in waves of alien music that made it hard to think, hard to remember why we were fighting in the first place. But the stones were old. Older than the creatures, older than whatever presence had taken up residence in this place. They'd been here first, marking this spot as something to be avoided, not embraced. I started backing toward the nearest stone, dragging Ashley with me and hoping Jennifer would follow. The creatures noticed the movement and quickened their approach, but something held them back. They couldn't quite bring themselves to get too close to the carved symbols. "Michael," the Robert thing said, its voice sharp with warning. "Don't touch those stones. They're dangerous. They'll hurt you." But that was exactly what I was hoping for. If the stones could hurt these things, maybe they could protect us too. I reached out and pressed my palm against the carved symbols, expecting pain, expecting to be burned or shocked or worse. Instead, I felt clarity. The alien music in my head stopped abruptly, leaving blessed silence. The oppressive atmosphere that had been pressing down on us lifted, and I could think clearly for the first time since we'd entered the forest. The creatures recoiled as if I'd struck them. The Robert thing let out a shriek of rage and pain, its borrowed face twisting into something that belonged in a nightmare. "Jennifer," I said, "the stones. Touch the stones." She didn't hesitate. The moment her hand made contact with the carved symbols, the change was visible. Her shoulders straightened, her eyes cleared, and the look of confused terror was replaced by determination. The creatures were backing away now, hissing and snarling. Whatever power the stones contained, it was anathema to them. But they weren't retreating far, just far enough to stay out of range of whatever protection the ancient markers provided. "We can't stay here forever," Jennifer said, "and Ashley needs medical attention." She was right. Ashley's breathing was shallow and irregular, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested internal injuries beyond just the broken ankle. If we didn't get her to a hospital soon, she was going to die. But the creatures were still out there, waiting. The moment we stepped away from the stones, they'd be on us. "There," Jennifer said, pointing to the opposite side of the circle. "Another stone. If we can reach it." It was maybe 30 feet away, 30 feet of open ground with hungry monsters on all sides. But it was our only chance. "On 3, I said, shifting Ashley's weight to get a better grip. 1, 2. We ran. The creatures converged on us immediately, but something about our contact with the stones had changed us too. We moved faster than we should have been able to, and when the first creature reached for Jennifer, she somehow dodged its grasping claws without even seeming to see them coming. The Robert thing swooped down from above, its mouth open to reveal that impossible array of teeth. But as it reached for Ashley, something stopped it, an invisible barrier that sent it tumbling backward through the air. We reached the second stone just as the creatures closed in around us. The moment our hands touched the carved symbols, they fell back again, snarling their frustration. "It's working," Jennifer gasped. "But how long can we keep this up?" I looked around the circle, counting stones. There were 7 more, spaced around the perimeter at roughly equal intervals. Each one was maybe 20 to 30 feet from the next. If we could reach them all, if we could make it all the way around. "There," I said, pointing to the stone that was closest to the tree line. "If we can reach that one, we might be able to get back into the forest. And then what? We'll still be lost. We still don't know how to get out of here. But at least in the forest we'd have somewhere to run. Here in the circle, we were trapped. The next jump was the hardest yet. The creatures had learned from our previous escape and positioned themselves to block our path. We had to weave between them, ducking claws and snapping jaws while carrying Ashley's unconscious form. The Robert thing was everywhere at once, appearing in front of us one moment and behind us the next. Each time it spoke, its voice carried more of the alien harmonics that made it hard to think. "You can't escape," it said. "This place is part of you now. You've breathed its air, drunk its water, slept in its embrace. You belong here, whether you accept it or not." But we made it to the 3rd stone, and then the 4th. With each jump, the creatures grew more desperate, their attacks more vicious. They couldn't touch us directly while we were in contact with the stones, but they could block our path, force us to take longer routes that left us exposed. It was during the jump to the 5th stone that things went wrong. Ashley woke up just as we started to run, and her sudden movement threw off my balance. I stumbled, and she slipped from my grasp, hitting the ground hard just outside the protection of the stone's influence. The creatures were on her immediately. "Ashley!" Jennifer screamed, but it was too late. I watched in horror as the things that had once been human tore into my friend with claws and teeth. Her screams cut through the night air for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds before they were abruptly cut off. When they stepped back, what remained wasn't recognizable as Ashley anymore. It was a broken thing of torn flesh and scattered bones, a collection of parts that had once been a person with dreams and fears and inside jokes about our co-workers. But then, impossibly, it started to move. The thing that had been Ashley sat up, its head hanging at an angle that would have been impossible for a living person. When it looked at us, its eyes were the same empty black as all the others. "Don't be sad," it said in Ashley's voice. "I'm still here. I'm just different now. Better." I felt something break inside me then. Not just horror or fear, but something deeper. The knowledge that we'd failed her, that she'd died because of our mistakes, that her last moments had been filled with unimaginable pain. But Jennifer grabbed my arm, pulling me back to the present. "We have to go," she said. "We have to keep moving." She was right. Standing here watching the thing that wore Ashley's face wouldn't bring our friend back. All we could do was try to prevent the same thing from happening to us. The next stone was only 15 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. The creatures had learned to anticipate our movements, and they'd positioned themselves in a solid wall between us and our destination. "Together," Jennifer said, "we go together, and we don't stop for anything." We ran straight at them. The creature's claws raked across my back, tearing through my jacket and shirt and into the flesh beneath. Jennifer cried out as teeth found her shoulder, but we didn't stop. We couldn't afford to stop. My hand hit the stone just as the Robert thing's claws wrapped around my throat. The moment I made contact with the carved symbols, it let out a shriek of pain and released me, its borrowed flesh smoking where it had touched mine. "You can't keep this up forever," it said, its voice layered with harmonics that made my teeth ache. "Eventually, you'll make a mistake. Eventually, you'll fall. And when you do, we'll be waiting." But I was starting to understand something about the stones, about the symbols carved into their surface. They weren't just protection, they were a message, a warning left by people who had encountered this place before and somehow survived to tell about it. The symbols were a map. "Jennifer," I said, studying the carved markings more carefully, "look at these symbols. They're not random. They're showing us something." She leaned closer, following my gaze. The symbols did seem to form a pattern. Lines and curves that might represent paths, geometric shapes that could be landmarks. "A way out?" she asked. Maybe, or at least a way to... I paused, studying one particular symbol that seemed more prominent than the others. It showed a figure standing over a dark circle, with lines radiating outward from its hands. To what? To fight back. The symbol was clear once you knew what to look for. It showed how to use the stone's power not just as protection, but as a weapon. The ancient people who had carved these warnings hadn't just run from whatever lived in this place, they'd found a way to battle it. But using that power would mean leaving the stone's protection. Stepping back into the circle where the creatures waited, it would mean facing the Robert thing and its assembled horrors without any guarantee that the ancient knowledge would be enough to save us. "Are you sure about this?" Jennifer asked. I wasn't sure about anything, but I was sure that running from stone to stone until we collapsed from exhaustion wasn't going to get us out of here. Eventually, we'd make a mistake, or the creatures would find a way around the stone's protection, and then we'd end up like Ashley, dead or worse. "Stay here," I told Jennifer. "If this doesn't work, then we die together," she said firmly. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same determination that had made her such a good team leader back at the office. Even here, even facing horrors that defied rational explanation, she wasn't going to abandon a teammate. "All right," I said. "Together." We stepped away from the stone's protection. The creatures rushed us immediately, but this time I was ready. Following the pattern shown in the carved symbols, I spread my hands wide and reached out with something that wasn't quite thought and wasn't quite will. Power flowed through me. Not my power, but something borrowed from the stones themselves, channeled through human consciousness into focused intent. Light blazed from my hands, not the warm yellow of sunlight, but something cold and white and absolutely pure. Where it touched the creatures, they screamed and fell back, their borrowed flesh smoking and dissolving. The Robert thing let out a howl of rage and pain, its form beginning to waver and distort. For a moment I could see through its disguise to what lay beneath, something vast and hungry and utterly alien, a nightmare given form that had been feeding on human suffering for centuries. "You cannot unmake me," it said, its voice now purely alien, without any trace of Robert's familiar tones. "I am older than your species, more enduring than your brief civilizations. I will be here long after your kind has fallen to dust." "Maybe," I said, pouring more power into the light streaming from my hands. "But you won't be wearing my friend's face while you do it." The light intensified, and the Robert thing's stolen form began to come apart. Layers of borrowed flesh peeled away like old paint, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath, something that my mind refused to fully process, something made of angles that didn't exist and teeth that went on forever. And there, at the center of it all, I saw him, Robert, the real Robert, trapped and screaming and held together by alien will, but still recognizably human. "Help me," he whispered. "Please." I reached out with the light, trying to free him from the creature's grasp. For a moment it seemed to work. The alien flesh recoiled, and Robert's form became more solid, more real. But then the creature fought back. Pain exploded through my skull as it tried to force its way into my mind the same way it had taken Robert. I felt alien thoughts trying to superimpose themselves over my own. Felt my sense of self beginning to fray at the edges. "Let me in," the creature whispered directly into my brain. "Stop fighting and let me show you what you could become." But I thought of Ashley, torn apart by things that had once been human. I thought of Robert, trapped inside his own body while something else wore his face. And I thought of Jennifer, standing beside me even though every instinct was screaming at her to run. "No," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. The light blazed brighter, fueled by determination and love, and a very human refusal to give up even when all hope seemed lost. The creature's hold on Robert weakened, and I saw him starting to pull free. But freedom came at a cost. As the alien flesh fell away, I could see that there wasn't much left of him. The creature had been feeding on him from the inside, consuming his memories and personality and life force. What remained was barely recognizable as the person I'd known. "Michael," he said, his voice weak but his own, "thank you." And then he was gone. Not taken by the creature, not transformed into something else, just gone. Released from a suffering that had gone on far too long. The thing that had been wearing his face let out a shriek of rage and loss. Without Robert to anchor it in physical form, it began to dissipate, becoming less solid, less real. "This isn't over," it said, its voice already fading. "Others will come. Others will fall. This place will feed again." "Maybe," I said, "but not today." The light from my hands pulsed one final time, and the creature vanished, its scream echoing through the forest before cutting off abruptly. The other creatures, the ones that had once been missing hikers and campers, collapsed as soon as their master was gone. Whatever force had been animating them withdrew, leaving only empty husks that crumbled to dust within seconds. Even the thing that had been Ashley fell silent, her borrowed features smoothing back into something that looked almost peaceful before the flesh itself dissolved, leaving only bones that looked clean and white in the starlight. The dark pool in the center of the circle began to drain, its impossible depths finally reaching bottom. The standing stones stopped glowing, their carved symbols becoming ordinary rock again, and for the first time since we'd entered the forest, everything was quiet. "Is it over?" Jennifer asked. "I think so," I said, though I kept my hands ready to channel that cold light again if needed. We stood there for several minutes, waiting for something else to emerge from the shadows. But the forest around us felt normal again. Not welcoming exactly, but no longer actively malevolent. "How do we get out of here?" Jennifer asked. I looked around the circle of stones, and for the first time I noticed something I'd missed before. One of the symbols wasn't just a warning or a weapon instruction, it was pointing, a simple arrow carved into the rock indicating a specific direction. "That way," I said, pointing into the forest. The path out was easier than the path in had been. We found a real trail within minutes, marked with proper blazes and showing signs of regular maintenance. Our phones started working again once we got a mile from the stone circle, and the GPS finally locked onto our position. We were only 3 miles from the parking area where we'd left the car. 3 miles from safety and civilization and the normal world where monsters didn't wear the faces of friends. But those 3 miles felt like the longest walk of my life. We didn't talk much on the way out. What was there to say? That we'd lost 2 friends to something that shouldn't exist? That we'd seen things that would give us nightmares for the rest of our lives? That we'd have to go back to work on Monday and pretend that everything was normal? The parking area was exactly as we'd left it, except for one thing. The rusted pickup truck was gone, leaving only a patch of oil-stained gravel to mark where it had been. "Maybe the owner came back for it," Jennifer suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. I didn't reply. I was thinking about how many people had probably driven up to this trailhead over the years, planning innocent camping trips and day hikes. How many had never made it back out? How many might still be up there, somewhere beyond the stone circle, waiting for the creature to wear their faces again? We drove back to Charlotte in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Jennifer tried to call the police twice, but both times she hung up before anyone answered. What would we tell them? That our friends had been killed by a monster? That we'd seen the missing hikers from the news reports, transformed into something inhuman? They'd think we were crazy. Hell, I was starting to think we were crazy. If not for the cuts on my back from the creature's claws and the bite marks on Jennifer's shoulder, I might have convinced myself that the whole thing had been some kind of shared hallucination. But the wounds were real. The pain was real. And Robert and Ashley were still missing. In the end, we reported it as a hiking accident. We told the authorities that our friends had fallen while trying to cross a steep ravine, that we'd searched for hours but couldn't find them. The search and rescue teams would look, of course, but they wouldn't find anything. The forest would have reclaimed all traces of what had really happened. It's been 6 months now since that night in the forest. Jennifer transferred to our Seattle office. claiming she needed a change of scenery. I don't blame her. Sometimes I think about doing the same thing, but running away doesn't change what we saw, what we experienced. The dreams haven't stopped. Every night I see Robert's face as the creature spoke through him, Ashley's broken form trying to convince us she was still our friend. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I hear voices calling my name from somewhere far away. I've researched the area obsessively, trying to find some rational explanation for what we encountered. There are stories, if you know where to look. Native American legends about hungry spirits that inhabit certain places. Colonial accounts of settlers who ventured into the deep forest and returned changed. Missing person reports going back decades, all from the same general area. But there are also stories of people who fought back, who found ways to contain or banish the things that shouldn't exist. The stone circle wasn't the only one. I found references to similar markers throughout the Appalachian region, all carved with variations of the same symbols. Warnings, instructions. Battle plans left by people who faced the darkness and somehow survived to tell about it. I think about going back sometimes. Not to the same place, but to one of the other sites. To learn more about the symbols, about the power they represent. To find out if there are other creatures like the one we fought, and if there are people still fighting them. But then I remember Ashley's screams as the things tore her apart, and I stay home. Some knowledge comes at too high a price, some battles are better left to others. But late at night, when the dreams are particularly bad and I can hear voices calling from the darkness outside my window, I keep the lights on and my hands ready to channel that cold, pure light. Just in case. Because deep down, I know it's not over. The creature is gone, but it was right about one thing. Others will come to that place. Drawn by the same strange compulsion that brought us there, or maybe just by bad luck and a wrong turn on a mountain road. And when they do, they'll find new stones marking the circle. Stones carved with symbols that Jennifer and I left behind. Warnings written in a language that transcends words. We couldn't save Robert and Ashley. But maybe, if we're lucky, we can save someone else. Maybe that has to be enough.